Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, the place where we take some of the biggest ideas we can find, set them down gently on the table, and look at them without rushing. Tonight, or this morning, or perhaps this slightly strange hour in between, we are stepping into a subject that has been sitting quietly beside humanity for a very long time. It has followed us into temples and campfires, into clay tablets and carved stone, into songs, poems, prayers and stories told to children who were supposed to be asleep 10 minutes ago. We are going to ask a question that sounds simple at first and then becomes less simple the longer you live with it. What if every ancient myth was trying to warn us? Before we wander any farther, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what the sky's doing above you right now. Is it dark and quiet? Is rain tapping at the windows? Is the sun just beginning to make promises over the rooftops? There is something oddly comforting about the thought that people in very different places can sit with the same old human question at the same time, separated by oceans and time zones and perhaps a slightly alarming number of unread emails, and still arrive at the same fire, so to speak. And if you find this sort of thing soothing, if you enjoy these long, slow journeys through science, history, mystery, and the very odd habits of our species, do consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and settling in for more. It helps the channel, it helps the algorithm behave itself for at least a moment, and it tells me that there are other people out there who are perfectly happy to spend part of their day asking whether myth might be less make-believe than we were taught. Now, when most of us hear the word myth, we know roughly what to do with it. We place it on a shelf marked stories, important stories perhaps, beautiful stories, symbolic stories, but still stories. We put myths beside gods who hurl thunderbolts, kings with impossible destinies, tricksters, monsters, miraculous births, sacred mountains, hidden underworlds, and all the other furniture of the ancient imagination. Then we thank them for their cultural service, admire a few of the better lines, and walk away feeling quite mature about the whole thing, which is fair enough. Modern people do like to feel mature. It helps us tolerate passwords, but there is another way to look at these old tales, and it begins with a small discomfort. The discomfort is this: why do so many ancient cultures, separated by vast distances and with no obvious way to compare notes, seem to remember the same kinds of disasters? Why do so many of them speak of immense floods, of fire falling from the sky, of darkness at noon, of stars or serpents descending from above, of worlds ending and beginning again, of proud cities swallowed, of older peoples wiped away, of the ground itself becoming unreliable? Why do stories from Mesopotamia, India, Greece, China, the Americas, the Pacific and beyond so often circle around destruction on a scale larger than one village's bad year? That does not mean all these stories are literal records, neatly filed by cosmic event type. Ancient storytellers were not amateur insurance adjusters. They were not sitting on hillsides with clipboards and saying, "Yes, that appears to be a 7 out of 10 apocalypse. Kindly initial here." Myths are imaginative, dramatic, exaggerated, layered with meaning and shaped by ritual, power, fear, hope and memory. They grow in the telling, they absorb symbolism, they become moral lessons, identity markers, political tools, religious maps. A flood in one generation can become divine judgment in the next, and sacred history in the one after that. This is true. And yet even after saying all that, the question remains: what exactly are they remembering? Because memory does not have to be precise to be real. In fact, human memory is almost never precise. It bends, it edits, it simplifies, it spares us some details and refuses to let go of others. Anyone who has ever tried to recall where they left their keys while vividly remembering a mildly embarrassing thing they said in 2014 will know that the mind has its priorities and they are not always helpful. Collective memory behaves in much the same way. A community may forget names, dates and measurements, but retain the shape of an event, not the spreadsheet, just the terror. not the exact sequence, just the lesson that the sea rose, the sky burned, the earth shook, and life was never quite the same again. That possibility changes the atmosphere at once, because if myths are not merely entertainment and not only symbolic drama, then they may also be storage, a kind of long-distance human storage. Not clean storage, not literal storage, but emotional and cultural storage. A warning preserved not in tables and graphs, but in stories dramatic enough to survive. Tell your descendants that once every few thousand years the coast may vanish underwater, and they may not listen. Tell them the sea once rose because the world had become proud, that only the prepared survived, that the foolish laughed until the water reached the treetops, and suddenly the memory has teeth. Suddenly it can travel. This is where things become especially interesting, because we modern people often assume that the past knew very little and the present knows very much. We flatter ourselves in this way all the time. We imagine ancient humans gazing helplessly at eclipses while we, masters of progress, stride confidently through history with satellites, climate models, and the ability to order batteries at midnight. There is some truth in that. We do know things our ancestors did not know. We can date ice cores, trace impact craters, model volcanic winters, and identify the signatures of tsunamis in layers of sediment. We can compare myth with geology, archaeology, climatology, and astronomy. That is no small advantage. Still, there is a danger in assuming that knowledge only counts when it appears in modern form. Ancient people may not have written scientific papers, but they observed the world with tremendous seriousness because their survival depended on it. They watched rivers, winds, stars, seasons, coastlines, birds, clouds, and the behaviour of animals. They knew which hills were safe, which valleys flooded, which sounds in the earth meant trouble, and which times of year carried unease. Their descendants often preserved that knowledge in the strongest container they had, which was not the academic article, but the story. A story could be repeated, it could be memorized, it could be performed, it could be tied to ritual and place. Most importantly, it could survive the loss of almost everything else. Imagine a coastline struck by a colossal wave. The settlement is destroyed. The survivors move inland. Children grow up hearing what happened. Their children hear it too. Over centuries, the event enters tradition. The sea becomes a living force, perhaps angry, perhaps sent by gods, perhaps tied to a taboo or a warning. The details shift. The central fact does not. Do not build there. Do not ignore the signs. The water once came farther than anyone believed possible. That message may be wrapped in myth, but it is still a message. And once you start noticing that possibility, myths begin to look a little different. The great flood stories no longer seem like isolated fantasies. Instead, they start to resemble echoes of something humanity may have experienced again and again in different forms and in different places. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically over thousands of years, swallowing vast areas that had once been dry land. Not overnight everywhere, but enough to transform coastlines beyond recognition. People who had lived near those coasts would have watched familiar ground disappear over generations. In some regions, there would also have been sudden catastrophic events, glacial lake outbursts, tsunamis, severe storms, river floods on scales hard to imagine until one is standing in them. If a people lived through that kind of world-changing instability, would they remember it? Of course they would. Would the memory remain neat and technical for 10,000 years? Probably not. Would it remain powerful? Almost certainly. Flood is only one pattern. Fire is another. Ancient myths are full of worlds destroyed by heat, flame, sun, lightning, dragons, serpents of fire or heavenly punishment. Sometimes the sky itself seems to attack. Sometimes the sun comes too close. Sometimes a blazing object falls from above. A modern reader might say, Very well, that is just how pre-scientific people explained volcanoes, meteors, or drought. And sometimes that may be exactly right. But notice what that means. It means they were explaining real events. Terrible events. Events worthy of being remembered. A volcanic eruption large enough to darken skies and poison land would not be forgotten quickly. A meteor airburst or impact, even a local one, would leave behind a memory far out of proportion to the size of the surviving population. The language would be mythical because myth was the language available. The experience beneath it could still be historical. There is also a recurring idea in myth that feels surprisingly modern in its implications. The idea that civilizations can vanish. Not just individuals, not just one ruler or tribe, but whole worlds. There are stories of earlier ages, earlier peoples, sunken lands, ruined kingdoms, cities swallowed by sea or sand, and proud societies brought low by forces larger than themselves. It is tempting to dismiss all of this as moral theatre. Humans do love a story about arrogance being punished. It saves a great deal of time in the final act. Yet archaeology has taught us, again and again, that societies really do collapse, sometimes suddenly, sometimes in layers, and often from combinations of climate stress, natural disaster, war, famine, disease, and political fragility. In other words, the old stories were not foolish to worry about civilizational endings. They may simply have lacked our preferred vocabulary for them. That may be one reason these myths lasted. They are not merely tales about the past. They are instructions for emotional readiness. They tell listeners that the world is older than they are, less stable than they would like, and not especially obliged to remain convenient. They remind people that seas can move, mountains can break, skies can darken, and communities that feel permanent can become archaeological footnotes. That is not a cheerful message, perhaps, but it is a durable one, and the ancients seem to have considered durability more important than cheerfulness, which, given some of their building materials, was a consistent theme. Now, there is another layer here, and it is the part that makes this whole question feel less like a museum visit and more like a conversation with the present. If myths do preserve memories of disasters humanity once faced, then they may also preserve something else, a catalogue of recurring threats: flood, fire, falling objects from the sky, famine, sudden cold, darkness, social collapse, migration, loss of coastlines, failure to prepare, failure to listen. These are not antique concerns. They remain, in one form or another, very much alive. We have different tools now, better science, larger systems, and far more people to place in harm's way. But the list itself has not gone out of fashion. In that sense, the old stories may feel familiar because the planet has not changed its basic habits. Earth still floods, Earth still burns, ice still melts, volcanoes still erupt, rivers still shift course, meteors still cross our sky, civilizations still imagine themselves sturdier than they are. We are brilliant, inventive, technologically elaborate creatures, but we're still living on a dynamic planet in a restless solar system. The ancients knew this in their bones. We know it in our data. One could argue that myth and science, far from being enemies, are two very different methods of remembering the same uncomfortable truth. Of course, we must be careful. It is easy to become overexcited in this territory. Some people see a lost advanced civilization behind every rock and an encoded prophecy in every household object older than 300 years. That way lies confusion, television specials with unsettling background music, and perhaps a man in a leather jacket pointing at a map with great urgency. Not every myth is a report. Not every symbol refers to a forgotten cataclysm. Similar stories can arise because humans share common fears, common environments, and common psychological patterns. Flood is a natural image for destruction and renewal. Fire is a natural image for punishment and cleansing. The sky is where weather, light, and danger often come from. We should not force every old tale into a modern disaster framework simply because it is exciting. But caution cuts both ways. We should not dismiss ancient memory simply because it comes dressed as myth. Oral traditions around the world have in some cases preserved accurate information for astonishing lengths of time. They have remembered coastlines, eruptions, migrations, and environmental change with far more persistence than a smug modern observer might expect. It turns out that repeating important stories for generations is a remarkably effective archival system, especially when the stories concern things that can kill you. Humanity did not survive this long by forgetting everything useful. So tonight we begin in that narrow, interesting space between gullibility and arrogance. We are not going to assume that every legend is secret science wearing a ceremonial hat. Neither are we going to assume that our ancestors were merely inventing decorative nonsense to pass the evening until someone discovered peer review. Instead, we're going to treat these myths as what they often are: dense human objects, part memory, part warning, part explanation, part identity, and part survival strategy. We will ask whether common stories point to common experiences. We will look at flood traditions, fire from the sky, ruined earlier worlds, and the recurring feeling that humanity has been here before and perhaps learned less than it likes to think. Because maybe the deepest question is not whether myth is true in every detail. That is probably the least interesting version of the problem. The better question is whether myth carries truth in a form designed to last. Whether our ancestors found a way to pass forward the outline of danger, even when everything else was vulnerable to loss. Whether stories became vessels for memory when memory was all that remained. And whether, buried beneath gods and monsters and divine judgments, there is still a recognizable human voice saying something plain and urgent. This happened. It can happen again. Pay attention. That possibility, once entertained, is difficult to put down. It means that the oldest tales on Earth may not only tell us who our ancestors believed themselves to be, but also what they feared most, what they survived, and what they hoped their descendants would never be foolish enough to forget. And as we move further into these old accounts, with their drowned lands and burning skies and vanished peoples, it becomes worth asking just how many civilizations, in one way or another, kept trying to tell the future the same thing. It is worth lingering for a moment on that strange repetition, because once you notice it, it becomes rather difficult to unnotice. You can travel across continents and across centuries, moving from one culture to another, one language to another, one collection of gods and heroes to the next, and again you find people speaking about endings. Not the ordinary ending of a single life, and not only the familiar rise and fall of kings, but something much larger. A former world swept away, a previous age destroyed, humanity nearly erased, a great flood, a sky of fire, a collapse so total that the survivors had to begin again, puzzled and frightened, looking around at a changed landscape and trying to explain to their children what had just happened. That alone should make us pause, because human cultures differ in all sorts of ways. They organise family and power differently, they worship differently, they cook differently, they build differently, they write songs in different rhythms, argue with different ancestors, and wear very different hats. And yet so many of them seem to circle the same dark idea, that the world can end without asking permission, and that it may already have done so before. Why would that memory appear so often, unless it answered to something deep in the human experience? One possible explanation is the simplest. Perhaps civilizations remembered the end because civilizations really did experience endings, over and over again, in many forms. Not always the end of the whole species, of course. Humanity is frustratingly persistent. We have survived ice, drought, famine, plague, migration, warfare, and architecture that should not have passed inspection. But local endings, regional endings, cultural endings, those are common. A city can vanish, a coastline can disappear, a river can abandon the people who trusted it, a volcano can reduce a kingdom to a lesson. An empire can look invincible on Monday and archaeological on Thursday, speaking in broad historical terms. From a modern point of view, it can be tempting to separate myth from disaster, as though one belongs to imagination and the other to geology. But ancient people did not live in that neat division. For them, a catastrophic event was never merely physical. If the earth shook, then the gods were involved, or spirits, or cosmic order, or a broken taboo, or some vast meaning hidden inside the terror. A flood was not only water, it was also judgment, warning, cleansing, chaos, memory and explanation all at once. We may prefer to file events into tidy categories called natural and cultural, but ancient minds often treated those as one woven fabric. The river overflowed and the moral order cracked. The mountain erupted and the heavens spoke. The world was not mute, so disaster could not be mute either. That matters because it helps explain how memories of destruction survive for so long. A bare fact is easy to lose. A meaningful story is much harder to kill. If a community simply says, "Many generations ago the shoreline moved inland by several kilometres due to rapidly changing sea levels and a severe storm surge," then the information may be accurate, but it is not exactly gripping. It has all the emotional pull of a cautious museum placard. But if the same community says the sea once rose to punish arrogance, swallowed the old settlements, and left only the wise or the fortunate alive upon the high ground, then people listen. They repeat it. They pass it on. The story gathers force. Children learn where not to build. Adults remember where to run. The memory survives because it has been wrapped in drama strong enough to cross generations. This is one reason so many cultures remember some version of a lost world. Memory prefers shape. It prefers characters, causes and consequences. It wants to know not only what happened but why, even when the why is beyond reach. When people experience overwhelming catastrophe, they do not simply record it. They interpret it. They place it inside a moral universe. They ask whether someone offended the gods, whether humans became greedy, whether sacred rules were broken, whether the world had grown old and needed to be remade. That habit is not evidence of ignorance so much as evidence of being human. We are meaning-making creatures. We have a hard time leaving terror unexplained. A random disaster is difficult to live with. A disaster with a story around it, however frightening, can at least be remembered without dissolving into chaos. There is also the matter of recurrence. Civilizations remembered the end because the end, in one form or another, kept turning up. Rivers flood repeatedly. Drought returns, forests burn, winters fail. Earthquakes revisit the same faults. Seas rise and fall over long stretches of time. Storm tracks shift. The sky occasionally throws down something alarming. Even without a single global cataclysm linking every tradition, there were enough real catastrophes in human history to seed many memories of destruction. If you live close enough to danger for long enough, you do not need imagination to invent endings. You need only a coastline, a mountain, a river plain, or a patch of sky with unfortunate intentions. And ancient people often lived very close to danger indeed. Early civilizations tended to form in places that were rich, fertile, and strategically useful, which also meant exposed. Great river valleys brought water, transport, and farming, but also catastrophic floods. Coastal settlements opened trade routes and food sources, but also invited storms, tsunamis, and long-term sea change. Volcanic landscapes could be fertile and sacred and magnificently beautiful, right up until they became educational in the most unpleasant sense. Even deserts and uplands had their own forms of collapse, through drought, failed rains, dust, hunger, or the simple fact that 1 week season can become 3, and then no one is using the word temporary anymore. So perhaps it should not surprise us that ancient memory is crowded with endings. What would be surprising is the opposite, a past full of serene confidence, where everyone assumed tomorrow would resemble today, and the earth was basically a polite and well-regulated host. The past was not like that. In many ways, the present is not like that either, though we are very good at pretending. We install drainage systems, write building codes, watch satellite forecasts, and then act shocked when a river decides to express itself. Ancient people had fewer buffers, so the violence of the world was often more immediate. They lived closer to dependence, and dependence teaches memory. Still, recurrence alone does not explain the similarities. It explains why many societies would remember disaster, but not necessarily why those memories so often take parallel forms. Why so many floods? Why so many worlds ending in fire or darkness? Why so many stories of an earlier age destroyed because humans had gone wrong in some fundamental way? There are several reasons for this, and one of them is that humans everywhere inhabit broadly similar bodies and minds. We fear drowning because water will drown us. We fear fire because fire is ruinously persuasive. We fear darkness because it removes orientation and control. We fear things from the sky because they arrive from outside our management, which has always been one of our least favourite arrangements. In other words, some symbols recur because the dangers recur and because human beings react to them in comparable ways. Water is an obvious universal. Every culture depends on it. Every culture fears too little of it and too much of it. The same substance that sustains crops, fills rivers, cleanses bodies, and allows trade can also wipe out towns, rot grain, spread disease, and erase boundaries in a single terrible season. It is therefore not at all surprising that water becomes one of mythology's preferred tools for ending a world. It is familiar enough to feel intimate and dangerous enough to feel divine. You can understand why it becomes not just weather, but judgment. Fire has a similar role. Fire cooks, warms, protects, and transforms. It is civilization in one mood and annihilation in another. A hearth is comfort. A wildfire is history being rewritten. A volcanic eruption, or a rain of burning debris from the sky, is almost too vivid not to become sacred memory. The ancients did not need to invent the terror of fire. They only needed to survive it long enough to tell the tale. And because fire destroys with such visual certainty, because it blackens, consumes, and leaves behind a changed world, it naturally becomes one of the oldest human metaphors for endings. It also has the advantage of being very memorable, which is not a sentence one wants tested personally. Then there is the structure of time itself in ancient thought. Many civilizations did not imagine history as a straight line moving neatly forward from primitive beginnings to enlightened adulthood, which is a modern story we tell partly because it flatters us, and partly because it helps explain why our kitchen appliances come with software updates. Ancient cultures often thought in cycles. Ages rose and fell, worlds were created and destroyed, order gave way to corruption, then was renewed. This cyclical way of thinking makes the end easier to remember because the end is not unique. It is part of a pattern. If the world has ended before, then disaster is not meaningless interruption. It is built into the structure of things. That perspective may have emerged not from abstract philosophy alone, but from lived experience. Seasons cycle, flood seasons return, drought returns, plants die and grow back. The moon waxes and wanes, human generations replace one another, ruins accumulate beneath new settlements, build long enough in one place and eventually someone digs up the stones of those who believe they were the permanent arrangement. A cyclical view of reality is not only spiritual speculation, it may also be the natural conclusion of watching the same forces return across a lifetime, while the marks of earlier peoples remain just visible enough to make one uneasy. There is another reason many civilizations remembered the end, and it has to do with the fragility of civilization itself. We often speak as though civilization is a sturdy thing, a kind of great stone machine that, once established, rolls forward under its own weight. In truth, it is more like a balancing act performed by millions of interdependent people who all require food, water, relative stability, and some confidence that the roof is likely to remain above them. Remove enough of those at once and the performance becomes noticeably less elegant. Ancient societies discovered this repeatedly. When crops failed, trade broke down. When rivers shifted, capitals weakened. When earthquakes struck, temples fell. When invaders arrived during drought or famine, collapse accelerated. Endings were remembered because they happened at scales big enough to feel like the world itself had failed. And from the point of view of those living through such moments, that feeling would not be exaggeration. If your city falls, your records burn, your rulers vanish, your roads become dangerous, your food stores fail, and your neighbours flee or die, then the end of the world does not mean the destruction of the planet. It means the destruction of the world that made sense to you. Your map of reality collapses. Your gods may remain, the stars may remain, the mountains may remain, but the human order you trusted is gone. It is entirely understandable that such experiences become stories not of inconvenience but of endings. This may help explain why myths often combine natural catastrophe with moral failure. Modern people sometimes roll their eyes at this, as though ancient storytellers were unable to distinguish between weather and ethics. But there may be a deeper observation hidden there. Catastrophes are rarely only natural in their effects. A flood becomes worse when warning signs are ignored, when settlements are poorly placed, when social bonds fail, when elites hoard resources, when preparation is neglected, when memory has decayed. In that sense, many myths are not simply saying that the gods became cross. They are saying that societies become fragile when they forget limits. Pride, greed, disrespect, and complacency are mythic language for systemic vulnerability. That is not an especially ancient problem. One could even call it a thriving modern tradition. The details have changed. Our irrigation software is better. Our bureaucracy is more ambitious. Our ability to produce meetings about resilience is unmatched. But the core pattern remains. Societies flourish, begin to mistake stability for permanence, ignore certain warnings, and then act offended when the world resumes being a world. In this light, ancient stories about endings may be less superstitious than they first appear. They may be primitive in wording but sophisticated in pattern recognition. They link catastrophe to human behaviour because human behaviour always shapes catastrophe's reach. There is also the long memory of the Ice Age world, or rather the world that came after it. For most of human existence, the coastlines we know today were not the coastlines people knew then. Huge amounts of water were locked in ice, sea levels were lower, and land now underwater once supported people, animals, and movement across regions that later became separated by sea. As the climate warmed and the ice retreated, coastlines shifted dramatically over long periods. Whole habitable zones disappeared. To the people living near them, this would not have felt like a quiet geological footnote. It would have felt like the world moving. Even if the process unfolded over generations, the cumulative effect could easily settle into tradition as the memory of a drowned land, a lost world, a place where the ancestors once lived before the waters came. Now imagine that such memories are then combined with later floods, storms, tsunamis, and local catastrophes. They would layer. Story would absorb story. A community might remember a real coastline inundation from deep time, a later river flood from living tradition, and a moral teaching added by priests or elders, all braided into one account. That is part of what makes myth so difficult and so fascinating. It is not one kind of thing. It is memory, symbol, theology, geography, politics, and instruction all fused together. The result can look fantastical on the surface while still preserving a hard core of remembered reality. Oral tradition is especially important here. People sometimes underestimate it because it is not written, and modern societies often assume that what is unwritten is unreliable. Yet oral cultures can preserve strikingly durable information, especially when that information matters for survival. Song, ritual, place names, repeated formulae, ceremonial retellings, and sacred obligations all help lock memory into a community. A warning spoken once is fragile. A warning sung for generations becomes architecture in the mind. The ancients may not have had cloud storage, though they had rather more actual clouds to contend with, but they had repetition, and repetition is powerful. It is also worth noting that myths often remember the end because they are trying to solve a visible puzzle. Ancient people lived among ruins. They encountered abandoned cities, buried walls, toppled stones, strange mounds, older graves, traces of societies whose names had partly vanished. If you live in the shadow of ruins, you do not need to be told that worlds can disappear. The evidence is under your feet. The natural question becomes, what happened here? Why did these people fall? And if their end is visible in the landscape, what might that say about ours? Myths of prior ages and destroyed civilizations may not have been created from nothing. They may have been responses to the undeniable fact that humans before you had built magnificently and then lost it all. So many civilizations remembered the end because the end is among the most useful things to remember. Origins matter, yes. Every culture tells stories about beginnings, where the people came from, how the world was ordered, why the sun rises, why death exists, why rivers flow, why one tribe is cousin to another, and why certain foods are frowned upon at formal occasions. But endings matter just as much, perhaps more. Origins explain identity. Endings explain danger. Origins tell you who you are. Endings tell you what can happen if the world turns, or if your people forget what the world is capable of. In that sense, an ending story is a survival document disguised as a sacred tale. And perhaps that is the deepest reason these memories are so widespread. Human beings are not only storytellers, we are survivors descended from other survivors. The stories that lasted were not always the prettiest or the most comforting. They were often the most memorable, the most emotionally charged, the ones carrying instructions hidden inside awe. Remember the waters, remember the fire, remember the darkness. Remember that there were those who came before you and believed themselves secure. Remember that the land itself is not a fixed stage. Remember that the sky is not always gentle. Remember that forgetting is costly. Once you begin to see myths in that light, their repetition stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a pattern of cultural preservation. Different peoples, different symbols, different gods, but the same underlying insistence that catastrophe belongs to human history and cannot safely be treated as impossible. Some communities remembered the end because they had watched the sea erase homes, others because they had seen forests burn or mountains explode, others because drought had broken kingdoms, or because ruins from older people stood as a permanent warning that civilization has a shelf life if enough pressures arrive together. The forms vary, the memory remains, and among all those recurring forms, one rises above the rest with an almost unsettling persistence. Again and again the old stories turn to water, not rain in the ordinary sense, and not a seasonal nuisance that ruins the harvest and is then discussed irritably for months, but water on a scale that unhouses the world. Water that removes borders, drowns roads, swallows fields, uproots temples, and leaves survivors clinging to high ground, trying to understand how the familiar landscape has become an inland sea. If there is one image ancient civilizations seem unable to stop returning to when they imagine the end, it is that one, the deluge beneath every sky, and it is probably there that the memory becomes hardest to ignore. If there is one image the ancient world seems unable to leave alone, it is water rising beyond every promise it was supposed to keep. Again and again, from one culture to another, the story returns in slightly different clothes. A great flood comes. The old world is washed away. Most people are lost. A few survive by chance, by wisdom, by obedience, by luck, or because some god, ancestor, or unreasonably well-timed animal gave them notice. The waters cover fields, roads, homes, cities, memory. Then, when the water finally retreats, those left behind stand in a landscape that is no longer the one they knew. and history begins again with the uncomfortable knowledge that the world is much less stable than it looks. There is something almost eerie about how widespread that pattern is. Mesopotamia has it, the Hebrew tradition has it, Greece has it, India has it in more than one form, China has flood traditions woven deep into its cultural memory. Indigenous traditions across the Americas contain versions of world floods, drowning lands, or humanity remade after waters came. The Pacific holds stories of islands changed by sea and of ancestors escaping inundation. Aboriginal traditions in Australia preserve memories of coastal change and sea level rise that some researchers believe may reflect very ancient events. One can dismiss any single flood story as local imagination, local disaster, or local religion. But when the motif appears almost everywhere, one begins to wonder whether humanity is not inventing one image again and again so much as remembering, in many different ways, something it encountered repeatedly and found impossible to forget. Of course, we should begin with the obvious point. Floods are common. They are among the most universal and destructive disasters human beings face. If you settle near water, and most early societies did, you're signing a long and rather one-sided agreement with it. Rivers flood, monsoons fail and then overcompensate, storm surges push inland, snowmelt swells valleys, coastal waters advance in slow increments that only become shocking when measured against memory. Even a fairly ordinary flood by geological standards can feel like an apocalypse if it takes your crops, your animals, your roof, and half the people you know. So there is no mystery in why water becomes a global symbol of destruction. The real question is whether some of these stories remember not ordinary floods, but exceptional ones. Mesopotamia is a sensible place to start, because it was both one of the earliest cradles of urban civilization and a place where rivers could be generous right up until they became homicidal. The Tigris and Euphrates made life possible in a harsh landscape. They gave water, transport, fertile soil, and the conditions for cities. They also flooded unpredictably. With a temperament that could undermine the very societies they fed, it is not surprising that some of the oldest written flood narratives come from this region. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim tells of a divinely sent flood that destroyed humanity, with one chosen survivor building a vessel to preserve life. The story is ancient, layered, and theological, but it is not difficult to imagine how generations living under the shadow of dangerous rivers might preserve a memory of catastrophic inundation in exactly such a form. Water destroyed the world they knew. The gods became the language through which that terror was expressed. The biblical story of Noah follows a similar pattern, though shaped by its own moral and religious framework. There is corruption, warning, preservation, total inundation, survival, and a renewed world afterwards. Whatever one's religious position on the text, from a cultural point of view, it is striking how familiar the narrative shape already is. The flood is not a weather event in the ordinary sense. It is total. It resets history. And that quality of totality may be the crucial thing. Ancient flood myths are very often not about inconvenience. They are about the destruction of an order so complete that it feels like creation in reverse. The world returns to water, the boundary between land and chaos collapses, and the human task begins again from a handful of survivors. Greek myth offers its own version in the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survive a great flood sent by Zeus. Again, the same broad pattern appears. Humanity has gone wrong. Water comes as correction or cleansing. Most perish. A remnant remains. But what matters is not merely that Greece has a flood myth. It is that so many places do. One starts to feel that humanity, quite apart from its local religions, became attached to one basic intuition. At some point in the deep past, the line between land and sea did not hold, and memory never fully recovered from the insult. Then there are the flood traditions of South Asia, where the story of Manu describes a great deluge and a warning delivered in advance by a fish who tells him to prepare. It is a marvellous detail, and one that modern readers may be tempted to file under ancient storytelling exuberance. Fair enough. But beneath the talking fish is the same hard skeleton of memory, a vast flood, a chosen survivor, preservation, renewal. And perhaps that is how myth works so effectively. It allows memory to wear vivid, memorable forms. It attaches disaster to images that cannot easily be forgotten. A flood warning in the form of an ordinary memorandum is lost. A flood warning delivered by a fish large enough to alter history is much more likely to survive. China's ancient traditions are especially interesting because they often treat flooding not only as cataclysm, but as a political and civilizational problem. The stories surrounding Gun and Yu, for example, are not simply about destruction from water, but about the challenge of controlling it, channeling it, living with it. That feels important. Not all flood memory is about a single overwhelming deluge. Some of it may reflect a long struggle with rivers powerful enough to define statehood itself. In such cases, myth preserves not only the terror of inundation, but the cultural importance of management, engineering, and the legitimacy of rulers who can impose order on the waters. The message becomes slightly different. Water can end worlds, yes, but civilization itself is the project of pushing back. Across the Americas, flood traditions are similarly widespread. Many indigenous peoples preserved narratives of waters covering the earth, of mountain refuge, of survival by canoe, raft, or divine instruction, of humanity beginning again after widespread destruction. It would be foolish to flatten all these into one universal story. They belong to distinct cultures and landscapes. Some may refer to river floods, others to tsunamis, others to lake overflows, others to moral and spiritual themes that are not reducible to geology. But the recurrence still matters. It suggests that water has been one of humanity's most enduring teachers, and like many teachers of that sort, it was remembered best on the days it was least merciful. The Pacific, too, is rich with memories of changing seas, vanished lands, drowned places, and ancestral movements shaped by the water's shifting edge. On islands and coasts, the line between myth and environmental memory can become especially thin. A coastline altered by rising seas may, over generations, become the story of a land taken by the ocean. A tsunami may become the tale of a sea that stood up and ran inland. A dangerous reef may be remembered through a legend about spirits, monsters, or punishment, because practical memory survives more effectively when tied to emotion and taboo. The point is not that every such story is a literal transcript. It is that many of them may be preserving close observation in a form designed to last. One of the most intriguing possibilities is that some flood myths retain echoes of the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose dramatically as enormous ice sheets melted. The process unfolded over millennia, which can make it sound abstract and therefore harmless. But for people living through generations of coastal loss, it would have been anything but abstract. Whole plains, estuaries, and migration routes that once lay above water slowly vanished. Land bridges disappeared, coasts retreated, islands formed where none had been. Shallow continental shelves that had supported human life were inundated. To those communities, the sea would not have seemed like a stable border. It would have seemed like a force in motion advancing into memory. Now, a slow sea level rise over many generations does not look exactly like the sudden flood of myth. But memory compresses. Oral tradition condenses long processes into intelligible events. Several centuries of loss may become a story about the water's coming. A series of extreme floods may merge with a long-term coastal retreat until the distinction disappears. Add one major storm or tsunami to an already vulnerable region, and the whole pattern becomes unforgettable. Myth does not preserve the graph. It preserves the human meaning of the graph. It says, once there was land where now there is sea, and our ancestors did not always live where we live now. This possibility becomes especially compelling when oral traditions seem to remember ancient coastlines with surprising accuracy. In parts of Australia, for example, some Aboriginal stories describe places that were once dry land but are now underwater, and researchers have argued that these traditions may reflect memories reaching back thousands of years to post-glacial sea level rise. That does not mean every detail is historically precise, nor does it mean oral memory is magically infallible. But it does suggest that human communities can carry environmental knowledge far longer than many literate societies are inclined to believe. When a place is sacred, storied, and tied to identity, memory can become astonishingly durable. There is also the matter of sudden floods, which may be even more likely to produce myth. Consider tsunamis. If you have never seen one, the word can sound almost tidy, like a topic for a museum display or a badly chosen holiday conversation. But a tsunami is one of the most myth-making events imaginable. The sea withdraws, confusion follows. Then a wall of water arrives with a force that rearranges the coast in minutes. Villages vanish, boats are carried inland. Trees, bodies, animals, houses, shrines, roads, everything is lifted into motion. For survivors, how else would one speak of such an event except in language that sounds larger than ordinary reality? The sea rose. The world ended. The ancestors warned us not to ignore the signs. That is not primitive exaggeration. It is one of the most reasonable responses available. Volcanic eruptions can produce similar water disasters. An eruption can trigger lahars, collapse coastlines, alter river courses, melt snow and ice, generate tsunamis, darken skies, and poison fields. In a mythic tradition, these may all fuse into one account: fire in the mountain, water in the valley, darkness overhead, death everywhere. It would be a mistake to expect ancient memory to sort these experiences neatly into our modern hazard categories. The people living through them would not have said this is a hydrological event followed by secondary geomorphological disruption. They would have said the world came apart. Another possibility, less dramatic but perhaps just as important, is that flood myths endured because agriculture itself made people acutely aware of water's dual nature. Farmers depend on the right amount of water at the right time. Too little brings hunger, too much brings ruin. River civilizations in particular live in a permanent emotional negotiation with floodplain fertility. The river deposits rich soil, but it also threatens to deposit your neighbour's house in your courtyard. Over time, this creates a culture in which water is never only useful, it is always morally charged, politically charged, ritually charged. It blesses and destroys with unnerving ease. In such a world, flood myths are not decorative. They are expressions of the central fact that the substance keeping you alive can also take everything. This may help explain why the flood so often appears not just as an event, but as a reset. Water strips away boundaries. It erases roads, walls, fields, and markers. It reduces civilization to survivors and debris. In mythic terms, this makes it an ideal force for beginning again. Fire destroys too, but fire often leaves behind blackened outlines. Water abolishes. It returns the land to undifferentiated uncertainty. That is why flood stories are so often tied to recreation, to a new covenant, a new people, a new order. The old world is dissolved. The new one must be rebuilt. The symbolism is obvious, yes, but the symbolism likely draws its strength from real experience. Communities that survive catastrophic flooding really do emerge into a place where ordinary distinctions have been stripped away. There is a practical side to these stories as well. Myth can serve as hazard memory. A community tells and retells a flood narrative not only because it explains the past, but because it encodes behaviour. Climb to high ground. Respect the sea. Do not settle in certain places. Watch the animals. Notice when the water behaves strangely. Preserve boats. Honour seasonal patterns. Listen to elders who remember where previous waters reached. In some indigenous traditions around the world, stories connected to dangerous places or recurring natural threats have been understood precisely in this way as mnemonic systems for survival. The tale is sacred, but it is also functional. It says, remember this because one day you may need it. And there is something rather humbling in that. Modern societies often assume that hazard knowledge belongs mainly to technical experts, with maps, models, and acronyms. Those things are valuable. They save lives. But ancient communities, lacking our instruments, often developed powerful cultural methods for preserving environmental memory. A sacred story repeated for 2,000 years may guide behaviour more effectively than a PDF no one reads, because it arrived as an attachment after lunch. Humans are not only rational information processors, we are narrative creatures. We remember what scares us, what moves us, and what can be retold by firelight without anyone checking their phone. Still, we should resist the temptation to turn every flood myth into evidence of one singular global deluge. The desire to unify everything into one dramatic event is understandable. It makes for tidy documentaries and very untidy scholarship. Some flood stories may indeed preserve memories of exceptional regional catastrophes. Others may reflect the cumulative experience of living in flood-prone environments. Others may be shaped primarily by religious ideas of purification, destruction, and renewal. In many cases, it is probably all of the above. Myth is not a witness statement. It is a layered vessel. It stores memory, but not in isolation from symbol and belief. That layered quality is exactly what makes it so revealing. The ancients did not merely say water destroys. They said water returns when people forget something fundamental. That moral framing may sometimes reflect theology, but it may also point to a sharp observation about human behaviour. Flood risk is rarely only about rain or rivers. It is about where people build, what they ignore, which warnings they dismiss, what wetlands they drain, how much they trust yesterday's boundaries, and whether the memory of previous catastrophe has faded into complacency. In that sense, a myth that links flood to arrogance may be crude as meteorology, and quite sophisticated as social criticism. Because the most dangerous thing about a flood is often not the water itself, but the confidence that it will not come this far. That confidence appears in every age. It appears in ancient valleys, medieval ports, modern suburbs, expensive coastlines, and planning meetings with very polished tables. People forget, or they remember in theory but not in practice, which is often the more elegant form of forgetting. They know a place once flooded but not enough to move. They know the sea can rise, but not enough to prepare. They know the river has old paths, but not enough to stop building in them. Flood myths, viewed this way, are not just tales of what happened once. They are alarms against the permanent human habit of underestimating water until it is in the sitting room. And perhaps that is why the deluge beneath every sky remains such a powerful image. It is not only ancient, it is permanently relevant. It belongs to the deep past, yes, to drowned coastlines, broken river civilizations, swallowed villages, and memory compressed into sacred narrative. But it also belongs to any age that mistakes stability for a promise. The old stories do not survive because they are picturesque. They survive because they keep telling us the same unfashionable thing. The land is not fixed, the sea is not patient, rivers have long memories, and civilizations, however clever they become, tend to relearn the lesson only after the water has already started to rise, which leaves us naturally enough looking up from the floodplain and toward the sky itself, because in so many of the old stories, the next terror does not come from below, but descends burning from above. If water is the old story humanity tells when the world dissolves, then fire is the one it tells when the world turns against itself and begins to consume what it made. Across ancient myth, almost as persistently as the flood, there appears another ending. Not a drowning this time, but a burning. A sky that glows the wrong colour. A sun that grows harsh. Mountains that open. Ash that falls for days. Divine anger that arrives not as rain, but as heat. Cities collapse beneath flame. Forests disappear. Fields fail. the air itself becomes difficult to trust. Once again, one culture alone would not be especially surprising. Fire is universal after all, but so many traditions remember destruction by flame, by ash, by heavenly heat, by a world scorched or purified or remade through burning. That one begins to suspect the old stories are not merely inventing drama. They may be preserving contact with some of the most terrifying things human beings can witness on this planet. Fire has always occupied a strange place in human life. It is one of our oldest companions and one of our oldest threats. It warms, protects, cooks, hardens clay, forges tools, clears land, lights darkness, and gathers people together. It also escapes, spreads, blackens, devours, and leaves survivors staring at a landscape transformed into something both familiar and ruined. That double nature matters. Water can feel alien when it destroys. Fire feels intimate. It is already inside the home, inside the hearth, inside the torch and lamp and cooking pit. So when it becomes catastrophic, it feels like a trusted force turning traitor. Perhaps that is one reason fire so often appears in myth, not only as destruction, but as judgment. It is close enough to human life to seem personal. Think for a moment about what large-scale fire would have meant to an ancient community. Not a controlled burn, not a house fire in isolation, but a firestorm across a settlement, a season of wildfire, or a volcanic eruption whose ash and incandescent debris turn day into something half night and half nightmare. There would be the obvious destruction, homes gone, food stores lost, animals killed, fields ruined. But there would also be the sensory shock, the heat on the skin, the colour of the sky, the strange light, the smoke in the lungs, the sound, which eyewitnesses to modern wildfires and eruptions still struggle to describe without reaching for language that sounds mythic even now. It is not difficult to see how such experiences become stories of gods, punishment, monsters, or a world temporarily handed back to older and less forgiving powers. Volcanoes are perhaps the clearest place where myth and memory begin to overlap. A major eruption is the sort of event that seems almost designed to generate religion. The mountain shakes, the earth opens, fire appears where no fire should be, ash falls from the sky as though the heavens themselves are burning. Rivers of molten rock move with a patient certainty that makes panic feel embarrassingly small. Crops fail, water becomes foul, the sun disappears behind haze. If one wanted to invent an image for divine wrath, one could do worse than a volcano, though preferably from very far away and after checking the wind direction. Ancient peoples living near volcanic landscapes rarely treated them as ordinary features. They were sacred, feared, personified, tied to gods or spirits, and watched with a kind of reverence mixed with practical alarm. In Greece, Hephaestus and the forge beneath volcanic mountains gave one mythic frame to subterranean fire. In Roman thought, Vulcan's name itself became our word for volcano. In Polynesian traditions, the volcanic goddess Pele is not an abstract symbol, but a living force of creation and destruction, shaping land through fire while demanding respect. Across many cultures, the mountain that burns is not just geology. It is agency. Something is there. Something beneath the world can wake up. That does not mean these myths are primitive misunderstandings of plate tectonics, politely waiting for modern science to rescue them. It means they are cultural responses to phenomena so immense that meaning becomes unavoidable. A community living under volcanic threat learns quickly that the mountain has moods, signs, patterns, dangers. Strange smoke, rumbling, tremors, animal behaviour, the quality of the air, the colour of the horizon, all of this matters. Some of that knowledge may be preserved practically, much of it may be preserved ritually. You tell stories about the mountain because stories make people listen. You attach fire to gods because gods are harder to ignore than advisory notices. And eruptions do not only destroy in the dramatic, cinematic way our imaginations prefer. Sometimes their most devastating effects arrive afterwards, in ash, in poisoned water, in ruined harvests, in years of colder skies and uncertain seasons. This may be one reason ancient fire myths often include darkness, famine, and social collapse alongside the burning itself. The fire is only the beginning. The world after the fire is what really changes everything. A volcanic eruption can become not just a local disaster, but the beginning of migration, political instability, hunger, and the unsettling realization that the old certainties were built on a mountain with opinions. It is hard not to think here of places like Thera, the volcanic island now called Santorini, whose late Bronze Age eruption was one of the largest in human history. The event devastated the surrounding region, and may have contributed to upheaval in the eastern Mediterranean. Scholars remain cautious about linking it too neatly to later myths, and rightly so. The past is not a puzzle box that opens simply because we are excited. Still, one can understand why later traditions in a region shaped by seafaring, earthquakes, ash, and collapse might preserve stories of proud places destroyed in fire and water, or of civilization brought low by forces larger than itself. Even if no single myth can be traced directly to a single eruption, the cultural atmosphere of such events must have been immense. And then there is the broader pattern in myth of ages destroyed by fire. In various traditions, the world does not end only by water. It ends by burning. Hindu cosmology contains cycles in which worlds are dissolved and remade, with fire playing a cosmic role in destruction. Norse myth imagines Ragnarok with flames engulfing the world after chaos and battle. In some Greek traditions, there were ideas of humanity passing through successive ages, with catastrophe as part of the rhythm of cosmic time. Elsewhere, stories tell of suns too fierce, gods too angry, or heavenly fire cleansing a corrupted earth. Different theology, different symbols, same recurring intuition. Worlds do not only drown, they also burn. Why is that intuition so widespread? Partly because fire is one of the most obvious ways landscapes and societies are visibly erased. A flood is terrifying, but when waters recede, the land remains, altered but present. Fire can leave behind a blackened plain that looks like the afterimage of a world. Forests become pillars of charcoal. Settlements are reduced to foundations and ash. The air hangs thick with a smell that no one who's encountered it really forgets. For communities without modern fire suppression, large fires could become total very quickly. A city of timber, thatch, oil, cloth, and close-packed structures was always, in a sense, a future memory waiting for one spark too many. Wildfire, too, has likely shaped myth more deeply than we sometimes recognise. Today we often think of wildfire through satellite maps, climate reports, and unsettling footage. Ancient people would have encountered it directly, as a force moving through grassland, woodland, or settlement, with a speed and appetite that felt more alive than accidental. In dry climates especially, seasonal burning would be part of environmental memory. Some fires renew landscapes, others consume everything. To survive repeated exposure to such events is to learn that heat can reorganize a world in hours. No wonder myth so often speaks of God sending flame when human behavior has gone wrong. A society that clears unwisely, stores carelessly, ignores drought, or places too much confidence in its own arrangements may discover that fire is an excellent critic. There is also a likely memory of climate and drought hidden inside some of these fire traditions. A world burned need not always mean literal incineration from edge to edge. It may also refer to heat, failed rains, relentless sun, cracked earth, withering crops, and the slow devastation of landscapes pushed beyond what people expected them to endure. For an agrarian society, prolonged drought can feel very much like the world is being burned, even if no wall of flame is visible. Wells shrink, rivers narrow, trees die, dust rises, food disappears, social order begins to shake. Under such conditions, the language of divine fire, scorched earth, or a punishing sun may be less metaphorical than it first appears. the land itself has become hostile through heat. This makes stories like that of Phaethon particularly intriguing. In the Greek myth, the reckless son of Helios loses control of the sun chariot, causing parts of the earth to burn, rivers to dry, and lands to blacken before Zeus strikes him down. It is easy to read this as a moral tale about overreach, and certainly it is that. But it is also a vivid image of environmental catastrophe through excessive heat from above. The world is scorched because cosmic order is lost. That basic structure appears elsewhere too. When the sky behaves wrongly, the earth suffers. Whether the origin of a particular myth lies in drought, wildfire, atmospheric events, or pure symbolic imagination is not always knowable. Yet the persistence of scorched earth imagery suggests that many peoples knew very well what severe heat and fire could do to a landscape, and to the societies depending on it. There are even traditions in which multiple suns or an intolerably hot sky threaten life until divine or heroic intervention restores balance. In Chinese mythology, for example, tales of extra suns blazing in the sky speak to a world made unlivable by heat. One need not insist that such stories are literal descriptions of astronomical oddities. They may be symbolic. They may be poetic dramatizations of drought or extreme heat. They may also preserve a memory that what comes from above, light itself, can become too much. That is an important and unsettling thought. The sun is life. But in excess, life's source becomes life's undoing. Ancient myth understood this tension perfectly well. And then there is ash, perhaps the most haunting companion to fire in old stories. Ash is what remains when structure has been removed. It drifts down after the blaze, quiet and grey, coating what is left. In volcanic regions especially, ashfall would have been one of the most uncanny experiences imaginable. It resembles snow in the most threatening possible mood. It blots colour from the world. It enters lungs, water, roofs, fields and food. It turns daylight strange. It kills slowly as well as suddenly. If fire is the event, ash is the memory of it settling over everything. No wonder ancient accounts of destruction so often include not only burning, but a sky darkened and earth covered in residue. The world has not merely been attacked, it has been changed in substance. A major eruption or fire season could also create a kind of atmospheric unreality that would naturally enter myth. Red suns, black noon, strange weather, thunder within ash clouds, lightning in smoke, animals fleeing, the smell of sulphur, the sense that ordinary distinctions between sky and earth have broken down. Even in the modern world, eyewitnesses reach instinctively for apocalyptic language in such moments. They say it looked biblical. They say it felt like the end. Ancient people, with fewer conceptual partitions between environment and divinity, would hardly have needed encouragement to interpret the same spectacle as the action of gods. This is one reason I think it is a mistake to say that myths of a burning world are merely symbolic and leave it there, as though symbol somehow means detached from experience. Symbols come from somewhere. They are fed by contact with the world. A culture that repeatedly imagines cosmic fire is probably not doing so in total innocence of what fire, drought, eruption, or atmospheric devastation feel like. Myth magnifies, moralizes, and transforms, yes, but it usually does so around a core of recognizable human encounter. The ancients did not dream up destruction from flame because they lacked imagination for anything else. They did so because flame was one of the oldest and clearest ways reality itself could become unlivable. There is another layer to all this, and it concerns memory of collapse. Fire does not only destroy landscapes, it destroys records. A city that burns loses archives, laws, genealogies, contracts, letters, plans, the boring but essential paper trail of civilization. Even in pre-paper cultures, fire means loss of stored goods, sacred objects, tools, and the places where cultural continuity is physically anchored. A burned society may remember very vividly that it once knew more than it knows now. that feeling can easily become mythic. There was a former order. It ended in fire. The survivors began again with fragments. Stories of golden ages ending in flame may carry some of that grief, the knowledge that human worlds are not only mortal, but flammable. If we widen the frame beyond volcanoes and wildfire, the possibilities become even more striking. There are episodes in Earth's history when regional or global firestorms likely followed major impact events. We will come more fully to things that fall from the sky, because that deserves its own lingering attention. But even without dwelling on the mechanics yet, the basic idea would have been unforgettable to any human community unlucky enough to witness something comparable on a local scale. A blazing object overhead, a shockwave, fires igniting across the landscape, heat arriving before understanding. Such an event would enter tradition not as an unusual evening, but as proof that the heavens themselves could set the world alight. And perhaps this is why so many old stories blur the boundary between earthly fire and heavenly fire. Sometimes the gods burn the world from above. Sometimes the mountain does it from below. Sometimes the sun is too fierce. Sometimes a divine weapon falls. Sometimes dragons, serpents, or celestial beings breathe destruction. These differences matter within each tradition, but their convergence matters too. They suggest that ancient people experienced catastrophic heat and flame from multiple directions and folded them together into one broad family of warnings. The world can burn from beneath your feet, across the horizon, or out of the sky. However secure you feel, fire remains one of the ways order ends. There is a moral pattern here as well, and it is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as old-fashioned sermonizing. Fire myths often connect destruction to excess, arrogance, broken boundaries, or disrespect toward powers greater than oneself. We can translate this into secular language without losing much. Societies become vulnerable when they overreach, mismanage landscapes, ignore signs, overbuild in dangerous places, or assume the conditions supporting them will continue indefinitely. In dry lands, one reckless action can spread catastrophe. In volcanic zones, one ignored warning can turn a thriving settlement into an archaeological cautionary tale. In a broader sense, the mythic claim that fire punishes hubris may simply be an old, dramatic way of saying that reality has limits, and civilizations that forget those limits eventually receive correction in a language they cannot mishear. That point remains uncomfortably current. Fire is one of the great recurring forces of human history, and not one we have entirely domesticated. We can monitor, predict, evacuate, suppress, and model better than our ancestors could, but we're still living with heat, drought, combustible landscapes, urban density, industrial accidents, and all the usual human confidence that things will somehow remain within acceptable parameters, because they usually have before. Ancient myth would recognize that confidence at once. It would probably narrow its eyes at it. Still, none of this requires us to believe that every myth of a burning world is a coded report of one particular ancient catastrophe. The temptation to force a one-to-one explanation should be resisted. Myths are richer than that and less obedient. Some preserve memory of eruptions, some preserve drought, some preserve wildfires, some express theological visions of purification or cosmic renewal, some do several things at once. The point is not to flatten them into geology, but to notice that geology, climate and disaster have likely left fingerprints all over them. Fire is too recurrent, too concrete, too terrifying, and too culturally central to be only metaphor, and once you begin to see fire myths that way, a strange continuity emerges. The stories are not only about punishment, they're also about remembrance. They insist that the world has burned before, that landscapes once familiar were altered by heat and ash, that proud places can disappear beneath what feels like divine force, and that survivors carry these memories forward in language dramatic enough to endure. The gods who burn the world may be gods in one sense, yes, but they may also be mountains, droughts, lightning, forests, lava, and the ancient human realization that life depends on powers we never fully tame. So if the flood stories teach that the boundary between land and water can fail, the fire stories teach that solidity itself is no guarantee. Stone cracks, timber vanishes, crops blacken, air turns hostile. Civilization, for all its walls and storage jars and splendid confidence, remains vulnerable to heat in ways our ancestors never forgot for long. And somewhere inside many of those traditions, one can feel another anxiety waiting to be named, because some fires do not seem to rise from hearth or forest or mountain at all. They seem to arrive from above, sudden and brilliant, with the unmistakable suggestion that the next warning was not about what burned on earth, but about what once fell from the sky. And this is where the old stories become especially unsettling, because there is a category of disaster that seems to bypass all the ordinary arrangements of earthly life. Flood comes through river, sea, or storm. Fire comes through forest, drought, mountain, or human error. But sometimes the danger, at least in the way ancient people described it, did not appear to come from any familiar direction at all. It came from above. A blazing object crossed the sky. A star fell. A celestial weapon descended. The heavens opened and sent destruction downward in a burst of light, heat, noise, and terror. If flood myths are about the failure of the world beneath us, and fire myths are about the failure of the world around us, then these stories are about something even more disturbing. They are about the failure of the world overhead to remain merely decorative. There is a special kind of fear reserved for threats from the sky. Human beings have always depended on the sky for orientation, weather, time, and comfort. The sun rises, the moon changes shape, the stars keep their courses, clouds move in recognizable ways. Even when the sky is dangerous, in storm or lightning or punishing heat, it still belongs to the ordinary grammar of life. You can learn its moods, you can prepare, at least a little. But a sudden object blazing across it, a fire from nowhere, a noise that splits the air without warning, that is different. It feels intrusive. It feels like reality has been breached. Something has entered the world from outside the normal agreement, and humans do not enjoy that feeling even on quite minor occasions, let alone when accompanied by explosions. That is one reason falling stars and fiery things from heaven became such powerful motifs in myth. They were not only visually dramatic, they were violations. Ancient people looked upward for order, and order is exactly what these events seem to suspend. A streak of fire in the night is beautiful if it remains at a comfortable distance and lasts politely for a few seconds. But if it grows brighter, louder, hotter, and ends with impact or detonation, beauty becomes terror with remarkable efficiency. The sky has ceased to be a background and become an actor. It is not hard to understand why pre-modern cultures treated such events with seriousness. Even ordinary meteors and meteor showers would have commanded attention in a world without artificial light. The night sky was richer, darker, more immediate. A meteor was not something noticed between advertisements or mistaken for a drone. It was a sudden incision in the heavens. Comets, too, with their long luminous tails and persistent presence, naturally invited fear and interpretation. They appeared without asking, stayed too long, and seemed to mark the sky with a kind of accusation. Across civilizations, comets were often taken as omens of political upheaval, war, death, or divine displeasure, or divine. One can smile at that now if one likes, but from the point of view of an ancient observer, the reasoning is not completely absurd. When the sky changes in a way it usually does not, and shortly afterwards something dreadful happens, people notice. Human beings are extremely good at noticing patterns, even when sometimes we notice rather more than the universe strictly intended. Still, omens alone are only part of the story. The more interesting question is whether some myths about falling stars and fire from heaven preserve memories of genuine impact events, airbursts, or other catastrophic celestial phenomena. Here the ground becomes a little uncertain, though uncertainty is not the same as emptiness. We know that Earth is regularly struck by material from space. Most of it is tiny and burns up harmlessly, some does not. Larger impacts are rare on the timescale of a single life or even a single civilization, but rare does not mean imaginary. Human beings have lived under the sky for a very long time. It would be surprising if no communities had ever witnessed a destructive event of that kind. And if they did, what would they call it? They would not call it a meteoritic airburst with a particular yield estimate. They would call it a star falling, a god hurling fire, a serpent descending, a heavenly stone, a sun fragment, a divine weapon, a dragon of flame, or any number of other names that sound mythic to us because myth was the container available. We should be careful, of course. Not every flaming object in old stories is a meteor. Not every divine arrow from the heavens encodes a physical event. Yet once you admit that some ancient observers may have seen real celestial fire descend with devastating force, the old tales begin to feel less fanciful and more like emotional records of contact with something almost too strange to be described. Consider for a moment what an airburst would feel like to the people underneath it. There might first be a light, perhaps brighter than anything in the sky except the sun, then a roar, then heat, then a blast wave strong enough to flatten trees, structures, and bodies. If it happened at night, the effect would be even more extraordinary, a sun arriving where no sun should be, then exploding. In the aftermath there would be injury, burning, confusion, strange material, perhaps fires across the landscape, perhaps animals dead, perhaps a silence afterward that felt newly unnatural. No one living through that would describe it as a minor astronomical curiosity. It would become one of the central horrors of communal memory. There is a reason modern witnesses to unusual sky events still reach for mythic language. Even with all our science, when something bright and violent tears across the atmosphere, people say it looked apocalyptic, biblical, unreal, like the sky was exploding. That is not because modern people are secretly ancient peasants in disguise. It is because the human nervous system responds to such spectacles in a very old way. We know intellectually what meteors are, but knowledge does not stop awe, and awe mixed with danger is precisely the sort of thing out of which myth is made. One could argue that stories of gods hurling thunderbolts or celestial weapons belong to this general zone of experience. On one level, they are symbolic expressions of divine power. On another, they may arise from living in a world where the sky genuinely does strike the earth from time to time. Lightning, of course, is part of that experience too, and we should not forget it. Lightning is perhaps the most common example of a destructive force from above, and many mythic weapons may draw as much from lightning as from anything extraterrestrial. But the categories need not be clean. For an ancient community, lightning, meteors, comets, eclipses, fiery atmospheric phenomena, and unusual celestial events may all contribute to the wider impression that the heavens are capable of sudden violence. Myth gathers them into families. It says, what is above you is not always passive. There are also traditions around sacred stones that fell from the sky. Meteorites have been revered in many cultures because they are exactly what they appear to be, objects not of the ordinary earth. One need not be a geologist to grasp the significance of a strange metal or stone associated with a fiery descent. It would be treasured, feared, worshipped, or incorporated into ritual because it carries the authority of the sky. That alone tells us something important. Ancient people were not unaware that objects could come down from above. In some cases, they recognized it directly. The boundary between heaven and earth was not merely philosophical, it could be physically punctured. Then there are the stories of stars falling in great number, or of celestial battles scattering fire across the world. These appear in many traditions, sometimes as signs of the end of an age, sometimes as omens, sometimes as divine conflict, sometimes as punishment. The imagery is strikingly consistent. The heavens, usually the realm of order, become unstable. Lights fall. The The upper world intrudes upon the lower. This may reflect ordinary meteor showers woven into cosmology, but one wonders whether in some cases the memory is sharper than that, perhaps tied to extraordinary meteor storms or to rare events whose brilliance exceeded anything a community had seen before. In a world where the sky is red for signs, unusual celestial intensity would not be forgotten quickly. It is also worth remembering that before modern astronomy, the distinction between star, planet, comet, meteor, and other luminous phenomena was not ours to impose retroactively. Ancient observers were often quite skilled sky watchers, but their interpretations were guided by different frameworks. A bright bolide, a comet hanging in the sky for weeks, a conjunction, an eclipse, a meteor storm, all might feed into one symbolic system linking heavenly disorder with earthly consequences. To us that can seem muddled. To them it was coherent. The sky was a field of meaning. When that field behaved strangely, the world below was expected to respond. This brings us to a particularly important possibility. Some myths may preserve not only the sight of falling fire, but the social shock that followed. Suppose a celestial event caused local devastation, fires, loss of life, crop failure, or mass fear. Even if the physical damage was limited compared with a giant impact, the cultural effect could be immense. Priests would interpret it, rulers would respond. The event would be folded into existing beliefs about legitimacy, sin, fate, and cosmic order. Over generations it might grow, but it would grow around a very real human experience, the day something from the heavens struck and the world felt penetrated by forces beyond anyone's control. Ancient texts and traditions are full of this logic. Comets foretell dynastic change. Falling stars accompany the death of kings. Heavenly signs precede war or plague. A modern historian may say, sensibly enough, that these are retrospective patterns imposed after the fact, and often they are. But even so, that tells us something. It tells us that ancient societies already regarded celestial irregularity as deeply serious. They were prepared, culturally and emotionally, to treat the sky as a warning system. If an actual destructive event occurred, it would not merely frighten them physically. It would slot straight into a worldview ready to interpret it as an omen, judgment, or message. One of the more haunting possibilities is that certain oral traditions may preserve memories of impact craters or meteorite falls more directly than literate societies have tended to expect. In some parts of the world there are traditions associated with unusual landscape features that describe fire from the sky, a place struck by something divine, or a taboo around sites where the heavens once touched earth. It is easy to dismiss such things as later folk explanations attached to strange geography. Sometimes that may be correct. But the possibility remains that some are the other way around, not stories invented to explain a crater, but stories descended from genuine communal memory of what happened there. If even a few cases are true, then myth is doing exactly what we suspect it may be doing elsewhere, carrying hazard memory across astonishing lengths of time. What matters most is not proving each case beyond dispute. The past rarely offers that courtesy. What matters is recognizing how plausible the general mechanism is. A rare celestial event occurs. Survivors interpret it using available language. The story is repeated because it is too shocking to lose. It becomes sacred because sacred things are remembered. It gathers moral meaning because terror always seeks explanation. Eventually it becomes myth. By the time later listeners hear it, gods and serpents and stars and punishment may stand beside the original event, but the emotional architecture remains intact. Something came from above. It was bright, violent, and transformative. People were not prepared. They wanted their descendants to remember. This may also explain why many myths blur together heavenly objects and living beings. Dragons fall from the sky. Serpents of fire descend. Celestial beings battle overhead. Stars are not just objects, but agents. To a modern mind, that sounds like personification. To an ancient mind under stress, it may also be the most natural way to describe motion that feels purposeful and alive. A blazing trail writhing across the sky is not a spreadsheet. It looks like a thing. It behaves like a thing. It arrives with the drama of intention even when physics is doing all the work without consultation. Myth gives agency to what experience already made feel animate. There is an additional reason these stories endure, and it has to do with helplessness. A flood may allow warning. A drought unfolds over time. Even a volcano sometimes gives signs. But a destructive object from the sky offers almost no negotiation. It arrives across boundaries no one can defend. It is the purest expression of vulnerability. The heavens, which seem distant and orderly, suddenly reveal themselves as a source of arbitrary force. That experience is not only terrifying, it is philosophically destabilizing. It tells people that danger need not come from familiar enemies, poor harvests, or known landscapes. It can descend from beyond the human map altogether. That has enormous myth-making power. Human beings build confidence by learning patterns. We like trouble we can at least place in a category. Trouble from above resists that comfort. It feels absolute. One can understand why it so often becomes a sign of divine displeasure or cosmic transition. The old order no longer holds. The sky itself has intervened. History is about to become someone else's problem, which, in strictly practical terms, is not ideal. And yet the old stories are not only frightened by these events, they're also deeply attentive to them. Ancient skywatchers were not foolish. Many civilizations tracked celestial cycles with astonishing care. They knew the heavens far better than most modern city dwellers do, precisely because they depended on them and lived beneath them without electric interference. That means unusual phenomena would stand out even more sharply. A community with intimate knowledge of the regular sky is especially well equipped to notice when the regular sky has misbehaved. Myth, in that sense, may be less about wild imagination than about disciplined noticing, followed by culturally shaped remembrance. This is where the warning aspect becomes especially interesting. If myths about falling stars preserve any real disaster memory at all, then they are carrying a message both simple and profound. Humanity has faced threats from beyond the Earth before, and it may again. Not often, perhaps. Not on a schedule useful to policy meetings, but often enough, over long stretches of time, that our ancestors found it worth embedding in sacred memory. The warning is not that one specific prophecy will be fulfilled by Tuesday. It is that the sky is part of the risk environment. We live under a beautiful dome that is also a corridor for stone and ice moving at astonishing speed. Ancient people may not have known the equations, but they appear to have grasped the mood, and there is something quietly humbling about that. We moderns often feel that our age has brought the heavens into rational reach. We track near-Earth objects, map trajectories, and discuss planetary defense with a seriousness that would have delighted or perhaps alarmed our ancestors. Yet the emotional truth has not changed much. A large impact remains one of the few natural threats that can ignore borders, armies, and most forms of wealth with perfect indifference. The terror from above is not obsolete. It has merely been translated into technical language. Myth said falling star. We say impact risk. The difference is real, but it is not as absolute as we sometimes flatter ourselves into believing. The old stories also suggest another pattern, one that becomes clearer the longer one looks. Catastrophe is rarely remembered in neat categories. A thing falls from the sky, and then there is fire, perhaps flood, perhaps darkness, perhaps famine. One event cascades into others. Ancient myth often preserves that sense of chain reaction. The heavens send a sign, then the earth changes. This may be symbolic, but it may also reflect genuine observation. Large natural disasters do not stay politely in one box. A celestial strike may ignite fires. A volcanic eruption may darken skies. A tsunami may follow an earthquake. A drought may lead to war. Our ancestors may have encoded not just isolated hazards, but the broader fact that worlds collapse through combinations. That matters because it brings us back to the deeper question behind all these tales. Are myths merely imaginative stories, or are they fragments of humanity's longest memory? By the time we reach the recurring image of falling stars, it becomes harder to dismiss the second possibility entirely. Not because every legend is factual, and certainly not because every celestial image points to one hidden ancient apocalypse, but because the pattern is too human, too plausible, and too durable. A rare, violent event from the sky would be exactly the sort of thing people would remember for generations, and exactly the sort of thing that would survive best in dramatic sacred form. So perhaps the terror from above stayed with her because it revealed a truth more disturbing than any single impact. It revealed that human life is lived not only on a restless planet, but beneath an active sky. We are not sealed off. The world is open in both beautiful and dangerous ways. Ancient people felt that openness acutely. They watched the heavens with reverence because reverence was the correct emotional response to a place that gave light, order, seasons, and the occasional reminder that it also contained missiles. And once the sky has become a source of memory in that way, another strange category of story begins to make a little more sense. Because many ancient cultures did not only remember floods, fires, and falling stars, they also remembered something even more difficult to classify. The idea that there had once been other worlds before this one, other peoples, other ages, perhaps even other civilizations, all of them lost now, collapsed into ruin or legend, leaving only scattered traces and the recurring suspicion that humanity has stood among the remains of more than one ending. And perhaps that is one of the oldest unsettling thoughts humanity has ever had, not simply that the world can end, but that it may have ended before, more than once, for other people whose names are now gone. Not monsters, not always giants, not necessarily some hidden race with implausibly advanced cutlery, but earlier worlds in the human sense, earlier peoples, earlier orders, earlier civilizations that lived, built, believed, traded, ruled, fought, worshipped, and then vanished so thoroughly that only ruins remain to suggest they had ever been here at all. This idea appears in ancient traditions with remarkable persistence. There are myths of previous ages of mankind, of lost golden worlds, of civilizations swallowed by sea, of proud kingdoms reduced to dust, of ancestral peoples who were destroyed and replaced, of sacred cities abandoned after divine anger or cosmic upheaval. Sometimes the earlier world is morally superior, a lost age of harmony. Sometimes it is arrogant and corrupt, rightly swept away. Sometimes it is simply older, stranger, and no longer available except through fragments. And that pattern, once again, invites a difficult question. Why were so many cultures prepared to imagine that others had come before them and fallen? One answer is that they did not have to imagine very hard. They could see the evidence. Ancient people lived among ruins all the time. We moderns sometimes forget this because archaeology has become a profession, and ruins now tend to come with fencing, pamphlets, and somebody nearby selling magnets. But for most of human history, ruins were simply part of the landscape. You built a village near a broken wall whose makers no one clearly remembered. You found dressed stone in a field and reused it. You passed mounds that once held buildings. You walked among tombs older than your grandparents' stories. You inherited roads, canals, terraces, shrines, and foundations from people whose language had changed, whose rulers had disappeared, and whose world had already become a puzzle. That matters a great deal. If you live among visible remains of lost societies, then the idea of an earlier world is not abstract. It is local. It is underfoot. It is the hill no one farms because the stones beneath the grass are not natural. It is the shattered gate no one can quite explain. It is the old city buried beneath the current one, the layer of ash beneath the market, the toppled columns sticking out of the earth like bones. You do not need modern archaeology to feel the force of that. You only need eyes and enough continuity of settlement for one generation to ask another, who built this, and receive the answer, not us. And once that question enters a culture, stories begin assembling around it with remarkable efficiency. If a ruin is old enough, large enough, or strange enough, it almost demands myth. Human beings do not enjoy unexplained monuments. We like to know who made things and why, especially if those things are larger than our own houses and inconveniently impossible to ignore. So the ruined city becomes the work of ancestors, giants, gods, heroes, or a forgotten race. The broken walls become proof of a former age, the burial mound becomes sacred, the abandoned complex becomes a warning. However different the explanations, the basic mental habit is the same. These remains testify that there was once another order here, and it did not last. It is not difficult to see how that insight would shape myth. A people surrounded by traces of prior collapse would naturally absorb into its worldview the idea that civilizations are mortal. They rise, flourish, and disappear. Their roads become pathways for shepherds. Their temples become quarries. Their inscriptions become decorative patterns because no one can read them anymore. Their canals silt up. Their names shrink into stories. The lesson is so plain that one almost suspects our ancestors must have found us rather optimistic by comparison. We, after all, are forever treating our present arrangements as though they were the final and fully upgraded version of civilization, which is a charming habit for a species that still misplaces its charger every other day. Many ancient traditions therefore describe time not as a single continuous march upward, but as a sequence of ages. In Greek thought, there are the ages of man, with the golden, silver, bronze, heroic and iron ages descending through changing moral and social conditions. In Indian cosmology, there are vast cyclical yugas, world ages with decline and renewal built into the structure of time itself. In Mesoamerican traditions, there are earlier suns or worlds that perish before the current one. Norse myth also carries a strong sense of cycles, of worlds ending and beginning again. These systems differ profoundly in theology and detail, but they share a notable intuition. The present world is not the only world there has ever been. Others came before, others failed, ours is part of a longer rhythm. Now some of this is clearly philosophical and religious. We should not reduce every age myth to archaeology and costume. Human beings also think in cycles because they observe seasons, generations, decay, and renewal all around them. The old die, the young replace them. Kingdoms rise and fall, cities expand and contract, forests burn and regrow. So the idea of earlier worlds can emerge from reflection on time itself, and yet the visible remains of vanished societies would only strengthen that tendency. If you already believe history moves in cycles, ruins become proof. If you are unsure whether worlds can truly pass away, ruins answer that uncertainty with admirable bluntness. One of the most powerful examples of this is the recurring idea of a drowned or swallowed civilization, a place once great and now gone beneath sea, desert, jungle, or earth. The most famous example in the modern imagination is Atlantis, which has been stretched, polished, mystified, commercialized, and otherwise put through quite a lot over the centuries. Plato used it in part as a philosophical tale, and later generations have turned it into everything from moral allegory to advanced prehistoric theme park. It is wise to be cautious here. One can spend a lifetime falling into holes dug by Atlantis enthusiasts and emerge with a collection of maps, several arguments, and absolutely no lunch. Still, the enduring popularity of the idea tells us something. Humans are deeply receptive to stories of lost civilizations because the idea feels intuitively true. Not Atlantis specifically, perhaps, but the broader possibility that great societies can disappear and leave only hints. And of course they can. They have. We know this not from fantasy, but from archaeology and history. The Bronze Age collapse saw major powers in the Eastern Mediterranean falter or fall. The Maya experienced profound political and urban decline in several regions. Cities of Mesopotamia rose and fell repeatedly. The Indus Valley civilization changed and dispersed. Cahokia flourished and declined. Great Zimbabwe rose and transformed. Entire populations have moved, fragmented, been absorbed, or lost political coherence while their built environment remained to puzzle those who came later. Civilizations do not vanish into thin air, but to descendants or neighbours who inherit only fragments, disappearance can feel very much like magic. That feeling is important, because from inside history, collapse is usually messy, partial, and prolonged. From outside history, especially several generations later, it can look sudden and total. The records are gone, the roads are broken, the language has shifted, the memory is patchy. All that remains is the shape of absence. Something significant was here. Something ordered this space. Something ended. Myth enters precisely there, in the gap between visible consequence and lost explanation. Consider what it must have been like for a later people to walk through the remains of a city larger or more sophisticated than anything in their own immediate world. Massive walls, strange stonework, abandoned reservoirs, temples aligned to sky events no one remembers tracking, perhaps inscriptions no one can read, perhaps a road vanishing into scrub. The emotional response would not simply be curiosity, it would be dislocation. These people, whoever they were not simple. They organised labour, moved stone, fed populations and shaped the landscape at scale. And yet they are gone. That realisation can produce two opposite myths at once. Either the earlier people were greater than us, and we are the diminished heirs of a lost age, or they were flawed in some immense way and their ruin is a warning to us. Very often, ancient traditions manage to hold both views at the same time. This is one reason myths of earlier worlds so often involve moral decline. The lost civilization was rich, powerful, beautiful, technically skilled perhaps, but also proud, corrupt, impious, or forgetful of its limits. In a modern context, this can sound moralizing, and of course it is, but it may also reflect a real social insight. Large societies do not usually collapse for one simple reason. They become brittle, they overextend, they mismanage resources, they grow unequal, they lose flexibility, they trust complexity until complexity becomes dependence. Then a drought, invasion, flood, earthquake, trade disruption, epidemic, or bad run of luck arrives, and what looked permanent begins to come apart. Ancient storytellers may not have described this as systems fragility, but they clearly grasp the broad pattern. Greatness carries its own vulnerabilities. The higher the wall, the more memorable the ruin. There is also a more intimate psychological reason why humans imagine earlier worlds. We are descendants of survivors, yes, but also descendants of replacers. Every community exists where another once existed or could have existed. Forest becomes field, field becomes town, town becomes ruin, ruin becomes legend, legend becomes identity. Over long enough stretches of time, this process creates layers of belonging and displacement. Myths of former peoples may be one way. Societies negotiate that inheritance. They explain why we're here now, what happened to those before, and what relation we bear to the dead whose presence still shapes the land. Sometimes the earlier people become ancestors, sometimes rivals, sometimes cautionary examples, sometimes semi-divine beings. But they are rarely nothing. The landscape itself encourages this layering. A hill fort reused across centuries, a sacred spring honoured by multiple cultures, a road laid over older foundations, a city rebuilt after fire or conquest. All of this creates continuity mixed with forgetting. You do not have to invent a previous world when you are physically living on top of one. In many ancient cities, that was quite literally the case. Build, burn, rebuild, flood, rebuild, abandon, return, rebuild again. The earth beneath a settlement becomes stratified memory. Even without excavation, people know the ground contains earlier lives. Sometimes walls emerge after rain, sometimes graves are disturbed, sometimes foundations collapse into older rooms. The past refuses to stay buried neatly. And once again we come back to the possibility that myth is not only imagination but storage. A ruined city may generate a story that preserves in highly transformed form the memory of real collapse. The names are altered, the dates vanish, gods arrive, moral lessons accumulate, but the central content remains. There was once a society here unlike ours. It ended. The land remembers, so do we, though imperfectly. This may also explain why myths of earlier worlds so often include technologies, riches, or architectures slightly beyond the ordinary present. It is not necessarily because ancient people believed in fantastically advanced lost super-civilizations with aircraft, lasers, and a regrettable fondness for crystals. More often, I suspect, it is because ruins naturally exaggerate the past. If you inherit fragments of greatness without the process that created them, the creators can begin to seem superhuman. A toppled megalith is harder to comprehend than a house wall. A vast terrace system implies labour and organisation beyond immediate experience. A buried city seems almost impossible when seen only in pieces. Myth responds by enlarging the builders. They become giants, demigods, or people of a previous age when humans were different. That enlargement need not be foolish. It is a way of acknowledging scale. A society that cannot reproduce what it sees in the ruins before it is perfectly reasonable in concluding that the builders belong to another order. The mistake is ours if we assume that only literal gianthood could explain the story. Myth communicates felt difference. It says those people were more than us in some way, or at least different enough that ordinary categories no longer seemed adequate. That emotional truth may be exaggerated, but it grows from real confrontation with inherited complexity. There is a melancholy note running through many of these traditions as well. Lost worlds are not always remembered with triumph. Often they are remembered with longing. A better age has passed. A deeper connection to gods, nature, order, or justice has been lost. This may be nostalgia, of course, a permanent human hobby, but it can also arise from the visible contrast between present hardship and ancient remains. If the ancestors built on this scale, why do we not? If they knew how to channel water here, why is the canal dry? If this place was once full of people and ritual, why is it silent now? Ruins invite comparison, and comparison often produces sadness. At the same time, lost worlds can also justify the present. We survived where they did not. We inherited the land, we learned the lesson. Their error became our origin story. That is why earlier civilizations in myth are so often both admired and condemned. They are mirrors. Through them a society reflects on itself. Are we declining too? Are we morally weaker, more arrogant, less faithful, less wise in dealing with the landscape? Or are we the necessary renewal after their corruption? Myth rarely gives a final answer. It prefers tension. That is one reason it lasts. What makes this especially relevant to our wider question is the possibility that the old stories are preserving not just any memory of earlier peoples, but memories of peoples brought down by catastrophe. Flooded coasts, burned cities, drought-stricken kingdoms, earthquake-shattered ports, erupted islands, trade networks broken by cascading disasters. In later retelling, these may become vanished worlds, lost ages, punished civilizations. The cause may blur. The image of the ruin remains, and when enough cultures preserve some version of this, the cumulative effect is hard to ignore. Humanity seems to have remembered not only that individuals die, but that whole systems of life die with them. This is why I think ruins occupy such an important place in the human imagination. They are not merely scenic leftovers, they are arguments. They stand there saying that permanence is a mood, not a guarantee. They insist that order can become debris, that confidence can weather into lichen, that sacred and political power alike can be reduced to a puzzle for people who no longer share the language in which it was first declared. Ruins are philosophy built in stone. Unsurprisingly, mythology took them very seriously, and perhaps that is also why the stories of earlier worlds often feel half historical and half dreamlike. They are trying to bridge an impossible gap. On one side there is material evidence, on the other side there is missing time. Myth stretches across that distance. It says there were others, they lived here. Something happened. We are what came after. The details may be distorted, but the structure is often sensible. In many cases, it may be the most honest answer available when records are gone and memory must be carried by story alone. The deeper you think about that, the more natural it becomes that myths of previous ages would emerge almost everywhere. Human beings are constantly inheriting traces they did not create. Some traces are still functional, others are broken, some are buried, some are so old that even their ruin has become part of the natural world. To make sense of such inheritance, cultures tell stories, not because stories are a lesser form of truth, but because stories can hold uncertainty and meaning together at the same time. They can admit that the past is partly gone while refusing to let it disappear entirely. And that, perhaps, is the key thing. The old myths may not remember earlier worlds with documentary precision, but they do remember them with emotional accuracy. They remember the shock of encountering what remains after a civilization fails. They remember the unease of standing among works too large, too old, or too broken to fit comfortably into the present. They remember that human worlds can vanish and still leave enough behind to trouble the imagination for centuries, which leaves us with the next problem, because ruins alone do not become myth automatically. Stones do not moralize themselves. Buried walls do not spontaneously produce gods, warnings, and sacred narratives, tempting though that would be from a publishing perspective. Something has to happen between event and legend, between collapse and story, between surviving a disaster and retelling it until descendants treat it as the shape of reality. Somewhere in that long passage, catastrophe becomes memory, memory becomes symbol, and symbol becomes the thing a culture can carry forward without losing it altogether. Somewhere between the event itself and the story told centuries later, something very human takes place. A flood happens, or a fire, or a mountain opens, or a bright thing falls from the sky, and in the immediate aftermath nobody is thinking about myth. They are thinking about survival. They are looking for relatives, for food, for shelter, for the missing, for high ground, for dry ground, for any explanation that does not make the world feel newly lawless. The event is not a symbol yet. It is wet clothing, smoke in the lungs, broken homes, injured bodies, ash in water, fields gone, roads gone, the ordinary map of life suddenly erased. Myth does not begin there as a finished form. It begins there as shock. That is important, because we sometimes talk as though ancient people experienced something frightening and instantly wrapped it in a polished sacred narrative with convenient morals and excellent pacing. Real life is not so efficient. Catastrophe arrives first as confusion. Even in modern disasters with cameras, seismographs, emergency systems, and 24-hour reporting, people struggle to understand what has happened while it is happening. They misjudge scale. They miss causes. They remember certain details with absurd vividness and forget others entirely. They tell and retell what they saw, but each telling already shapes the memory. Ancient communities would have been no different in that respect. The difference is not that they were more imaginative. It is that story was the primary technology through which experience was stabilized. So how does catastrophe become myth? Not by accident, and not all at once. It passes through stages, each one making the event more survivable to remember and more durable to transmit. First comes witness, then comes retelling, then comes pattern, then comes meaning, then often sanctity. By the time the full myth exists, the original event may be buried under generations of interpretation, but it is still there in outline, like a coastline beneath a changed sea. Witness is the fragile beginning. someone survives, usually more than one person, though not always enough to create a clean record. They have seen something overwhelming, and for a while their descriptions may be raw. The river came higher than anyone had ever seen. The sky was black at noon. The mountain made a sound like the earth tearing. Fire ran across the hills. The sea pulled back and then returned standing up. A star crossed the sky and the trees fell flat. This earliest layer of memory may be factual in the plainest way, but it is also unstable. People are hurt, they are frightened, they are grieving, they may contradict one another, they may exaggerate without meaning to, or minimize because the full truth is too much to hold. Then comes retelling, and retelling changes everything. Human memory is not a cabinet where events are stored unchanged until retrieved. It is more like a workshop where memories are rebuilt each time they're used. Some details become fixed because they are vivid or useful. Others are lost because they are boring, painful, or difficult to explain. The exact number of days may vanish. The image of water reaching the treetops remains. The sequence of tremors may be forgotten. The sound of the mountain stays. The technical cause is obscure. The terror becomes unforgettable. In a community where memory must travel by voice, the memorable elements naturally survive best. This is the first step toward myth. Not falsehood, but selection. Catastrophe becomes a story because a story can be remembered better than a list. It needs shape. It needs a beginning, a disturbance, and a result. There was a time before. Then the warning signs appeared or did not. Then the disaster came. Then some survived and some did not. The shape matters because shape allows repetition. A shapeless trauma is hard to pass on. A structured account can cross generations. Very quickly, pattern enters the process. Human beings are pattern-hungry creatures. We do not merely ask what happened. We ask what kind of thing it was. Was it like the storm from years ago, only worse? Was it like what the elders said happened to the ancestors? Did it come after certain signs? Did animals behave strangely? Did the river change colour? Did people ignore a taboo? Did the priests fail? Did the ruler offend the gods? Did the sky warn us? These questions are not all superstitious in the dismissive sense. Some are attempts at real hazard recognition. Others are moral or cosmological. Most communities would mix them without seeing a contradiction. This is where the story begins to move away from raw witness and towards shared interpretation. It is no longer only about what happened to one group of survivors. It is about what the event means within the framework of the culture. If the community already believes the world is morally ordered, then catastrophe will be read morally. If it believes ancestors remain active, then ancestors may become part of the explanation. If the landscape is sacred, then the event may reveal that sacred geography has been violated or misunderstood. If the society has old stories about previous floods, fires, or darkness, the new disaster will be folded into those older patterns. Memory does not begin from zero. It enters a system already waiting to receive it, and that system shapes what lasts. A society that honours elders and oral continuity may preserve details through repeated ceremonial telling. A society governed through priesthoods may formalise the event into liturgy or sacred history. A politically centralised society may frame catastrophe around kingship, legitimacy, or divine mandate. A small mobile community might attach the memory to roots, landmarks, and practical warnings. In every case, myth emerges not only from disaster itself, but from the social machinery that processes disaster into something transmissible. This is why myths from very different cultures can share deep similarities and yet still feel distinctly local. The underlying event type may be broadly familiar: flood, fire, falling sky, ruined city, but the cultural treatment differs. One people remembers a deluge as divine punishment. Another remembers it as the work of a trickster or sea spirit. Another turns it into a story of the wise ancestor who prepared. Another makes it part of cyclical cosmology. Another ties it to specific mountains, islands, or clans. The event type may be universal. The myth is always culturally situated. It carries the fingerprints of the people who kept it alive. Emotion plays an enormous role here. Myths survive because they are emotionally efficient. A disaster stripped of feeling does not travel well across generations, but attach it to fear, awe, grief, guilt, wonder, or sacred obligation, and it becomes much harder to forget. This is not a flaw in memory. It is one of memory's main engines. People remember what moved them. Communities remember what threatened identity or survival. A story of a great wave survives because the wave was not merely large. It terrified people, separated families, changed settlement patterns, and redefined the relationship between community and place. That emotional charge often invites exaggeration, but exaggeration is not necessarily the enemy of truth. If the sea came inland farther than anyone could imagine, then saying it covered the world is not a scientific description. It is an emotional truth about scale. If ash fell for days and blocked the sun, saying the heavens went dark expresses how it felt to those beneath it. If a city collapsed and records vanished, saying an age ended may be more meaningful than specifying which administrative structures failed first. Myth tends to enlarge because catastrophe itself feels larger than ordinary language can handle. In that sense, exaggeration may be one of the ways truth survives when ordinary description would undersell the event into forgettability. There is also compression. This is one of mythology's most important habits. Events that unfolded over years may be remembered as one decisive turning point. Several floods may merge into one great flood. Long coastal retreat may become the story of the sea swallowing the old land. A chain of eruptions, fires, and famine may become one story of the gods burning the world. Separate collapses may fuse into the memory of an earlier civilization destroyed in a single age-ending catastrophe. This can frustrate modern historians because it muddies the chronology. But it is perfectly understandable from the perspective of oral memory. Communities do not preserve timelines the way archives do. They preserve significance. Compression also helps make stories portable. A complex sequence with many conditions and local details can be difficult to teach. A concentrated narrative is easier. The wise ancestor listened. The foolish did not. The sea came. The mountain burned. The old city vanished. The survivors climbed. The world changed. These are not precise records in a modern sense, but they are highly effective memory forms. They carry core lessons while allowing flexibility in retelling. Another force-shaping myth is morality. This is often the point where modern readers become impatient. We see a story linking catastrophe to pride, disobedience, impurity, impiety, greed, or broken custom, and we assume the original event has been buried beneath moralism. Sometimes it has. But morality is not simply decorative. It is one of the strongest tools communities have for preserving behaviour. If survival depends on respecting a landscape, remembering warning signs, or avoiding certain dangerous places, then attaching moral weight to those rules makes practical sense. The coast is not just risky. It is taboo in certain conditions. The mountain is not just active. It is sacred and must not be disturbed. The sea withdraws, and that is not curiosity. It is a sign to flee. When behaviour is wrapped in ethics or ritual, compliance becomes more likely. In that sense, some myths are not only stories about punishment, they are cultural hazard systems. They encode environmental knowledge inside forms people are motivated to remember. Modern societies use maps, sirens, signage, education campaigns, and emergency alerts. Ancient societies also used those things in whatever practical forms they had, but they added something else. They embedded warnings inside identity itself. To belong to the community was to know the story. To know the story was to inherit the lesson. This can keep memory alive long after the original context has grown dim. Ritual strengthens the process even further. A story told casually may fade. A story performed annually linked to place, season, and ceremony, becomes part of the structure of collective memory. Ritual imposes repetition, and repetition is preservation. It also gives catastrophe a shape that can be emotionally managed. Instead of an open wound in memory, the event becomes something the community revisits in controlled form. The flood is reenacted in symbol. The ancestors are honoured. The mountain is appeased. The dead are remembered. Through ritual, trauma becomes tradition. Not harmlessly, not completely, but durably. Place matters just as much. Some myths remain powerful because they are tied to physical landscapes that keep prompting remembrance. A cliff where people fled, a valley filled with ash, a shoreline where the sea once reached, a crater, a ruined mound, an abandoned city, a sacred spring, a mountain no one trusts completely. When story is tied to place, the land itself becomes a cue. You see the sight and the memory returns. The landscape teaches through narrative. This is one reason myth and geography are so often entangled. The story is not floating free, it is anchored. That anchoring also allows for practical detail to survive inside symbolic narrative. A tale might say a spirit lives on the slope and punishes those who sleep there. To an outsider, that may sound like pure superstition. To descendants, it may function as a warning not to camp in a place vulnerable to landslides, gas release, flooding, or some other danger. A story may forbid settlement beyond a certain ridge because ancestral waters once came that far. A sea legend may preserve an evacuation principle in memorable form. Myth often stores experience in a code that remains legible to insiders, even when outsiders hear only fantasy. Of course, not all myths are hazard manuals. Some become grand cosmological structures far beyond any single event. Yet even there, catastrophe may be the seed. A real flood can become part of a theology of destruction and renewal. A volcanic eruption can feed a broader vision of cyclical time. A ruined city can become evidence for moral decline across ages. Myth tends to scale upward. It does not like to leave events at the level of local inconvenience. It asks what this says about the world as such. That is why ancient disaster memory so often expands into stories of creation, judgment, kingship, cosmic order, and the fate of humanity itself. Authority enters the process too. Some stories endure because powerful groups endorse them. Priests, rulers, elders, lineages, or ritual specialists may shape which version of a catastrophe becomes official memory. This can preserve truth, distort it, or both. A ruler may frame a flood as divine favour because he rebuilt afterwards. A priesthood may interpret fire as punishment to reinforce ritual norms. A people who survived migration after collapse may turn their escape into a sacred origin. Myths do not float above politics. They are used, curated, and sometimes sharpened to serve social order. That does not make them worthless as memory. It just means memory is rarely innocent. Over generations, symbolism deepens. The flood is no longer only a flood. It becomes chaos, cleansing, forgetting, rebirth. Fire becomes judgment, purification, renewal, hunger, sun, rage. Falling stars become omen, intrusion, divine violence, cosmic warning. Ruins become moral theatre, proof of former greatness, evidence that time moves in cycles. This symbolic thickening can make modern readers assume the historical core has vanished. Sometimes it has indeed become difficult to recover, but symbol and memory are not mutually exclusive. In fact, symbol may be the very reason memory survived. A bear report dies, a symbol-rich story lives. That survival is helped by narrative pleasure, which may sound almost indecent in the context of catastrophe, but it matters. Stories that are vivid, strange, dramatic, and slightly terrifying are easier to remember than calm, explanatory prose. A giant fish warning an ancestor, a world burned by an errant sun, a mountain inhabited by a god, a sea that rises because people forgot respect. These are not decorative additions only. They are mnemonic devices. They give the mind something to hold. It is easier to remember a taboo enforced by a spirit than a mildly phrased recommendation from a long-dead official, much as that official may have tried his best. There is also the fact that communities change. Languages shift, beliefs evolve, political systems fall, migrations occur, new religions arrive. Through all that, a memory may survive precisely because it is adaptable. Myth is unusually good at adaptation. It can absorb new gods, new moral frameworks, new enemies, and new rituals while keeping an older narrative skeleton intact. A flood story may be retold under different theologies. A ruined city may be reinterpreted by each culture that inherits it. A cosmic fire may take on new symbolic layers in each age. This flexibility is not corruption in the simple sense. It is one reason myths can outlast empires, and that leads to a strange kind of reliability. Not reliability of detail necessarily, but reliability of persistence. If a motif survives many cultural transformations, it usually means it touches something deep, either psychologically, environmentally, or historically. Flood persists because water has always mattered, and because enough communities experienced catastrophic inundation to give the symbol hard roots. Fire persists because landscapes burn, mountains erupt, drought kills, and human societies remember heat with respect. Falling stars persist because the sky does occasionally violate expectations. Earlier worlds persist because ruins exist and civilizations fail. The mythic forms are stable not because they are invented well, but because they answer to recurring realities. Trauma itself may shape the process in one more important way. Communities do not always remember catastrophe directly, because direct memory can be too painful or too fragmented. Myth provides distance without erasure. It allows people to speak of destruction through gods, heroes, ancestors, and cosmic cycles rather than only through raw loss. In doing so, it makes memory survivable. A child can inherit a story about a flood ancestor more easily than a shapeless ancestral panic. A society can ritualize a burned city more easily than remain permanently inside grief. Myth is not only preservation, it is emotional technology. This is why I think it is a mistake to treat myth as the opposite of history. In many cases, it may be better understood as history after passing through human need. It is what happens when events are remembered by people who must continue living, teaching, building, worshipping, and warning future generations without the aid of archives, hazard databases, or institutional continuity. Myth is memory shaped for endurance. That shaping changes the material, yes, but not always beyond recognition. Sometimes it preserves precisely the part that matters most. And then, after all the retelling, moralizing, compressing, ritualizing, and symbolic thickening, something remarkable remains. The event has passed fully into culture. No one alive witnessed it. No one can date it. The exact causes may be forgotten, yet the story still says where the waters came, what the mountain did, why the old city vanished, what signs to watch, what places to avoid, what kind of arrogance invites trouble, what sort of landscape can betray the unwary. Catastrophe has become myth, but the myth still points back to the world, which is why the next step in our question matters so much. If stories carry one kind of memory, the earth carries another. Beneath legends, beneath ritual, beneath sacred language and inherited fear, the ground itself keeps records of flood, ash, impact, collapse, drought, and loss. Human memory reshapes. Stone, sediment, pollen, ice, and buried ruins keep their own account, and when we begin to compare the two, the old stories stop looking quite so lonely. The useful thing about the Earth is that it does not care whether we understand it properly. It keeps a record anyway. Human memory is selective, emotional, social, and often very dramatic. We remember what frightened us, what moved us, what was repeated, what fit our moral universe, and what could be turned into a story strong enough to survive. The ground remembers differently. It stores no opinions. It does not improve the pacing. It does not add gods or remove them. It leaves behind layers, scars, sediments, pollen, ash, salt, charcoal, broken walls, drowned forests, displaced boulders, shorelines where shorelines should not be, and ruins in places that no longer make sense unless the world around them has changed. If myth is one kind of memory, then the earth is another, and for a very long time we were far better at listening to the first than the second. That is partly because the earth's memory is not immediately readable. A story announces itself. A layer of marine sand buried inland does not. A band of ash in a sediment core does not begin by saying, "Hello there, I am the remains of a bad week several thousand years ago." Someone has to notice it, compare it, date it, place it in a wider pattern, and connect it to other traces. The record is there, but it is quiet. It takes time, patience, and an almost unreasonable willingness to spend parts of one's life thinking about mud. Fortunately, human beings do occasionally produce exactly that kind of person. Once we learned how to read these traces properly, a peculiar thing began to happen. The old stories, long treated as symbolic or fanciful or at best culturally interesting, started to look less isolated. Not because science proved every legend true in literal detail, which it did not and could not, but because the earth kept turning up evidence that our ancestors had lived through events large enough to deserve mythic memory. Floods on scales beyond ordinary seasonal nuisance, eruptions that darkened regions, abrupt environmental change, coastlines that moved, settlements buried, abandoned, or swallowed by sand, ash, or rising water. Again and again the ground quietly confirmed the broad point the old stories had been making all along. Humanity has encountered catastrophe many times before. Take flood first, because water leaves records everywhere if you know how to look. River valleys preserve flood deposits in layers of silt and sand. Lakes capture runoff and sediment from major events. Coastal marshes can hold evidence of tsunamis in the form of marine material washed far inland. There are buried channels showing where rivers once ran, shorelines marking old sea levels, drowned forests standing offshore, and settlements now submerged because the land-water boundary changed after people built there. None of this is poetic. It is practical, physical, measurable, and often quite rude in what it reveals about human assumptions. One of the humbling things science has taught us is that many places humans once treated as stable were only stable on the timescale of one generation's confidence. Coasts shift, estuaries flood, deltas migrate, lakes expand and shrink, ice melts, sea levels rise over long spans and occasionally in ways that, to communities living through particular episodes, would have felt catastrophic. If you are a person living on a coastline that slowly retreats over centuries, that may not sound dramatic to a modern reader used to graphs and long durations. But to those communities, each generation watches familiar ground lost to water. A burial site disappears, a path vanishes. A place where the grandparents once hunted is now offshore. A sacred grove is gone. The Earth's memory of that process survives in drowned landscapes. Human memory may survive in tales of old lands taken by the sea, and sometimes the record suggests something more sudden. Tsunami deposits, for instance, can preserve the evidence of water arriving violently where it should not have been. Marine sand appears in inland layers. Boulders are moved into implausible positions. Coastal forests are flattened and buried. Salt water intrudes into freshwater systems. Settlements show abrupt destruction. In such cases, when oral traditions speak of a great wave, a sea that rose, or ancestors fleeing to high ground, the comparison becomes difficult to ignore. Not because the myth becomes a scientific report, but because both kinds of memory appear to point toward the same category of event. The same is true of fire and ash. Volcanoes leave records with astonishing persistence. Ash layers can be traced across wide regions. They settle into lakes, bogs, and soils like a timestamp from the sky. Geologists can identify their origin, correlate them across distances, and sometimes reconstruct the scale of the eruption that produced them. Archaeologists then find settlements buried beneath those layers, fields abandoned, trade disrupted, lives interrupted. The Earth remembers with a clarity that is almost impolite. Here is the ash. Here is the village below it. Here is the evidence that people were there before and not in the same way afterwards. That kind of record changes the emotional texture of ancient fire myths. A people living near an active volcanic region did not need imagination to invent a world darkened by ash or a mountain associated with divine danger. They lived with a feature capable of rearranging their horizon and their food supply in one event. Even beyond volcanoes, charcoal layers and sediments can reveal major regional fire episodes, while pollen records show vegetation changing after severe burning, drought, or climatic stress. In other words, the land can tell us when landscapes burn differently or more intensely than usual, and when the plants that followed suggest long consequences rather than a brief seasonal nuisance. Once again, the Earth confirms something the stories already suspected. Fire is not just a symbol, it is a historical force. Then there are the traces of drought, which are subtler but no less profound. Pollen changes reveal shifts in vegetation. Lake levels rise and fall. Tree rings record wet and dry years with a patience that puts the rest of us to shame. Caves store climate information in mineral deposits built drop by drop over centuries. Ice cores preserve atmospheric history in frozen layers far from where the stories were told, yet still relevant to the conditions people had to survive. When those records show prolonged drying, cooling, abrupt fluctuation, or climatic instability around periods of societal stress, the old myths about burning worlds, failed order, or ruined ages begin to acquire a different flavour. Perhaps some of them were not describing literal walls of flame from one horizon to the other. Perhaps they were preserving what it feels like when the climate itself turns against the assumptions on which a society depends. That is one of the most interesting moments in this whole question, when modern scientific evidence does not vindicate myth word for word, but vindicates its seriousness. Ancient people may have described drought as the anger of gods, or an age going wrong, or a world burned by the sun. We would describe it in terms of precipitation patterns, circulation shifts, agricultural stress, and systemic vulnerability. The language is different. The human experience beneath it may be surprisingly close. Crops fail either way. Water becomes uncertain either way. Migration, conflict, hunger, and collapse still follow with a distressing lack of interest in terminology. The Earth also remembers impacts, though thankfully the large ones are rarer on human timescales. Impact craters endure, shocked minerals endure, strange distributions of material endure. In some cases, smaller meteorite falls or airburst-like events may leave less obvious traces, which makes matching them to human memory difficult. But the principle matters. The sky does strike the Earth. It always has. That fact alone means myths of falling stars, fiery descent and destruction from above belong to a world that really does permit such intrusions. The Earth's memory does not prove every celestial myth historical, but it removes any comfortable assumption that ancient fear of the sky was pure invention. Earth keeps the scars. Archaeology adds another kind of memory altogether. Not environmental traces alone, but evidence of how people lived, adapted, failed, moved, and rebuilt. We find settlements abruptly abandoned, cities rebuilt in layers after fire or flood, defensive patterns changing under pressure, storage systems altered, trade goods disappearing and then reappearing differently, buried ports now inland or underwater, wells running dry, agricultural boundaries shifting, households shrinking or moving uphill. In each case, the Earth is not only saying an event happened, it is saying people responded to it. Sometimes they adapted, Sometimes they did not. Sometimes their social order was more fragile than their monuments suggested. This is where the ground begins to speak almost directly to mythic themes of earlier worlds and civilizational endings. Many societies really did live atop the remains of older ones. Many cities really were built, burned, repaired, abandoned, and reoccupied. Many coasts really did host settlements now gone beneath water or sand. Many irrigation systems failed. Many once thriving centres shrank into puzzling ruins for later peoples to interpret. The mythic intuition that there were earlier worlds before this one begins to look rather sensible when seen against the archaeology of repeated collapse and renewal. The Earth remembers layers of civilization like a palimpsest no one intended to create. Even more striking is the way separate lines of evidence often converge. A story speaks of flood. Sediment records show unusual inundation. Archaeology reveals damaged settlement patterns. Oral tradition preserves a taboo about low ground. Generations later, modern researchers notice the pieces align, not perfectly, not with the satisfying neatness of fiction, but enough to suggest a common underlying reality. The result is not a triumph for myth over science or science over myth. It is something better. It is a recognition that different ways of remembering may sometimes preserve different parts of the same event. Of course, we should be careful not to become overeager. The Earth remembers many things, and human beings are dangerously fond of forcing patterns into clean stories once we spot 2 or 3 similarities. A flood deposit does not automatically prove a specific legend. A buried city does not confirm every tale told about it. Sometimes myths migrate from one culture to another. Sometimes symbols recur because human psychology is repetitive. Sometimes a ruin attracts stories long after the original memory has been lost. And sometimes the scientific record is incomplete, ambiguous, or simply not fine-grained enough to support the conclusions people wish to draw from it. It is possible to become intoxicated by correlation, which is a rather academic way of saying one can get carried away. Still, caution should not harden into dismissal. The older habit, the one that treated myth as decorative nonsense, and the Earth as mute unless it produced something immediately obvious, now looks far too confident. We know better than that. Oral traditions can preserve environmental memory surprisingly well. Landscapes do contain records of ancient catastrophe. Societies do encode hazard in story. The land and the story do sometimes point toward one another with an awkward but undeniable familiarity. This sensible response is neither to declare every myth literal, nor to insist that none contain historical memory. The sensible response is to compare carefully and take both forms of memory seriously. One of the most revealing examples of this seriousness is how often the Earth preserves not just single events but long vulnerability. This is a crucial point. Myths sometimes compress long processes into one dramatic tale, and the scientific record often shows why. A civilization may have faced repeated droughts, environmental strain, and political pressures over generations before a single severe event tipped it into visible collapse. Later memory may turn that drawn-out instability into the story of one great punishment or one world-ending season. From a historian's perspective, that is frustratingly imprecise. From a human perspective, it makes complete sense. Communities remember turning points more vividly than gradual erosion, even when gradual erosion is what made the turning point so devastating. The Earth is very good at exposing those long build-ups. Tree rings show repeated dry years. Pollen reveals declining ecological resilience. Sediments show repeated flooding. Architecture shows repairs, fortifications, relocation. Burial practices change. Trade shrinks. Then at last a layer appears. Ash. Flood deposit. Abandonment horizon. Destruction level. Something final enough to catch the eye. Myth tends to remember that final layer. The Earth remembers the conditions that prepared the disaster. Both matter, and together they tell a fuller story than either could alone. There is also something quietly remarkable about the way landscapes preserve memory, even when cultures do not. A community may vanish, its language disappear, its rituals fall silent, yet the marsh still contains the salt line of the great wave. The bog still contains the ash. The offshore shelf still holds the drowned forest. The city mound still contains flaws from repeated rebuilds. Human memory breaks. Earth memory accumulates. For long stretches of time they are disconnected. Then later generations, sometimes thousands of years later, begin to read the traces again and realize that the silence was never emptiness. The record was there the whole time, waiting for someone with the right tools and the right patience to notice. That should make us a little more modest about what we call forgotten. Forgotten by whom, exactly? By continuous human tradition, perhaps. By the soil, not at all. There is a strange comfort in that, though comfort may be the wrong word. Perhaps steadiness is better. The earth does not console, it does not moralize, but it does persist. It keeps the outline of floods after names are lost. It keeps the chemical signature of eruptions after gods change. It keeps bones, walls, seeds, grains of pollen, shifted stones and washed in sand after stories fade or are altered beyond recognition. And when those traces are finally read beside surviving myths, one gets the feeling of two archives meeting after a very long separation. What fascinates me most is that the Earth's memory often supports the broad caution at the heart of the myths, without supporting every dramatic detail. That is exactly what one would expect if stories were shaped by human needs, while still grounded in real danger. A flood myth may not tell us the exact hydrological sequence, but it may accurately preserve that a coastline or valley was catastrophically inundated. A fire myth may not distinguish eruption from wildfire from drought, but it may preserve that a landscape became unlivable through heat and ash. A legend of a lost world may not date a collapse correctly, but it may preserve the fact that people inherited visible ruins from an earlier society brought down by stress or catastrophe. The Earth remembers the mechanism. Myth remembers the meaning. And meaning is not trivial. It is easy for modern people to imagine that once the physical cause is known, the story has been replaced by explanation. But explanation and meaning are not the same thing. Knowing that ash layers came from an eruption does not tell us what it felt like to see the sky change for days, to lose crops, to bury the dead, to move away from ancestral ground, to explain to children why the mountain now has another temperament. The Earth remembers that the eruption occurred. Myth remembers what kind of reality it created for the people who survived it. One is not superior to the other in every respect. They answer different parts of the same human problem. This becomes even more interesting when science reveals just how dramatic some ancient environmental changes really were. People once dismissed tales of drowned lands as fantasy because the idea of large habitable areas now underwater seemed romantic and slightly suspect. Then, paleogeography, marine archaeology and sea level studies made it very clear that vast areas once used by humans are indeed submerged. People once treated stories of volcanic darkness or catastrophic regional disruption as theatrical exaggeration. Then tephra studies, eruption chronologies, and archaeological evidence showed that some eruptions truly did alter life across enormous spaces. People once smiled at the idea that societies could collapse under environmental strain remembered in moralized story. Then archaeology and climate reconstruction repeatedly demonstrated that environmental pressure and human fragility are frequent historical partners. None of this means the ancients had secret modern science hidden in myth. That would be its own form of vanity, just wearing a more flattering costume. They had something different. They had intimate experience of landscape, long oral memory, and a practical need to preserve the outline of danger. The Earth's record does not reveal ancient scientists disguised as poets. It reveals communities whose stories were sometimes shaped by realities larger and more persistent than later skeptics were willing to grant. There is a related point here that often gets missed. The Earth remembers ordinary events too, not just spectacular catastrophes. Seasonal floods, modest droughts, low-level coastal change, repeated small eruptions, years of stress rather than singular endings, all of that leaves traces. But myth does not preserve all of it equally. Myth tends to collect around thresholds, the moments when accumulated pressure becomes undeniable. That's another reason the scientific record matters so much. It reminds us that the great stories may be the visible peaks of much longer histories of instability. Humanity may have inherited myths of endings because the Earth itself kept producing long periods of warning before those endings became obvious. The stories preserve the point at which the warning became unforgettable. That is an uncomfortably modern thought, and perhaps that is why it matters. We like to imagine catastrophe as an extraordinary interruption. The Earth often records it as the outcome of a pattern. Layers accumulate, pressures build, conditions shift. Then one event, one storm, one failed season, one quake, one wave, one eruption, one combination too many, and an order collapses. The old myths may simplify that complexity into a flood, a fire, a fallen star, a ruined age. The ground keeps the slower version. Put together, they suggest that our ancestors were not merely haunted by sudden destruction. They were living on a planet whose memory is made of thresholds crossed. This is also why I find the Earth's record so unsettlingly respectful toward myth. Not respectful in a sentimental sense, more in the sense that it refuses to let us dismiss ancient warnings as childish. The ground keeps producing evidence that the categories haunting mythology — flood, fire, darkness, sea change, collapse, vanished settlements, celestial intrusion — are not literary inventions detached from reality. They are part of the actual hazard structure of human life on this planet. The stories are stylized, moralized, compressed, and culturally transformed, yes, but the dangers themselves are real enough to leave physical scars. So when we ask what the Earth still remembers, the answer is more than a catalogue of events. It remembers that human worlds are temporary arrangements inside larger systems. It remembers drowned coasts, burned valleys, ash-darkened skies, changed rivers, broken food systems, abandoned houses, mass movement, long recovery, and places never reoccupied. It remembers that civilizations are not separate from geology, climate, and sky, but nested inside them whether they find that idea flattering or not. And once we begin to compare that hard, quiet record with the old stories carried by memory and ritual, another possibility starts to press forward. Perhaps legends and science are not standing on opposite sides of the question after all. Perhaps, in the most interesting cases, they're approaching the same ancient disasters from different directions and meeting somewhere in the middle. And this is the point where the whole subject becomes much harder to keep at a comfortable distance, because once legends and science begin to overlap, the old stories stop feeling like decorative background noise to history and start feeling more like another category of evidence. Not the same kind of evidence as sediment cores, radiocarbon dates, pollen records, or impact craters. Nothing so tidy. But evidence nonetheless, in the sense that they preserve human attention. They tell us what kinds of events struck people as large enough, strange enough, and dangerous enough to be carried forward long after names, borders, and exact dates had disappeared. That overlap does not happen in the crude way people sometimes want it to. Science does not march into the room, point at a myth, and say, yes, that was precisely a tsunami on a Thursday in 4123 BCE, kindly close the case. The real meeting point is messier and far more interesting. A legend preserves the memory of a great wave. Geological evidence shows repeated tsunami deposits in the region. Archaeology reveals settlement disruption or relocation. Oral tradition includes warnings about where not to live and what signs to watch for. None of that gives us a neat final answer, but it does something more valuable. It tells us that myth and material evidence may be circling the same reality from different angles. For a long time, modern culture preferred a simpler arrangement. Science was supposed to deal in fact. Legend was supposed to deal in imagination. One built the bridge. The other sat near it telling stories about why bridges mattered spiritually. It was a clean division and therefore quite appealing. The trouble is that real human history does not behave so neatly. People who experience disaster do not file their memory in separate labelled cabinets marked practical and symbolic. They make sense of what happened in the richest language available to them. And if the practical lesson survives precisely because it has become symbolic, then separating the two too sharply becomes less a sign of sophistication and more a sign that we have misunderstood how memory works. One of the clearest places this overlap becomes visible is in oral traditions tied to landscape. When a community maintains a story about a dangerous coast, a drowned plain, a mountain that must be respected, or a place where the earth once broke open, and when later scientific investigation finds evidence of past inundation, eruption, or fault activity in precisely that region, something important has happened. Not a magical confirmation of every detail, but a recognition that traditional knowledge may contain durable observations about environmental risk. That is not a small thing. It means stories can outlast records and still carry usable information. This is especially striking in places where oral traditions seem to preserve memories of sea level change or major coastal events. When a story says the ancestors once walked where the sea now stands, modern ears may hear metaphor, nostalgia, or sacred geography. Yet in some cases, the physical record makes it entirely plausible that such traditions do reflect genuine inherited memory of an earlier shoreline. That should make us more careful readers, not credulous but careful. It suggests that communities with long continuity of place may preserve environmental history in forms that outsiders mistake for fantasy simply because the language is unfamiliar. The same thing happens with volcanic landscapes. A mountain regarded as sacred, dangerous, moody, or inhabited by a power that punishes disrespect may sound to a certain kind of modern mind like superstition wearing local costume. But then one looks at the geological record and finds repeated eruptive activity, lahars, ashfall, or other hazards that would indeed make careful behaviour around that mountain an excellent idea. Suddenly the legend looks less like error and more like encoded caution. The god in the mountain is not a scientific explanation, but the social function of the belief may align remarkably well with survival in a dangerous environment. It is worth dwelling on that for a moment, because it tells us something broader about how knowledge is stored. Modern science values explicit explanation. It wants mechanism, measurement, prediction, replicable method. All of that is sensible and powerful. Traditional legend often values retention and behaviour instead. It wants the listener to remember, to respect, to avoid, to prepare, to repeat. These are not the same goals, but they are not enemies either. In fact, when dealing with recurrent natural danger, they can complement one another. Science tells you how the tsunami forms. Tradition tells you to run when the sea withdraws. Ideally, one would prefer both. And indeed, there are cases in recent history where traditional knowledge appears to have helped save lives precisely because it preserved memory of past catastrophe. Communities that remembered stories about the sea withdrawing before a giant wave, for instance, were sometimes better placed to recognise danger quickly. That is where the overlap between legend and science becomes almost embarrassingly practical. One is not merely a quaint cultural layer added to the real information. It may be part of the real information, preserved in a form that human beings can use under pressure. Still, overlap is not always functional in such a direct way. Sometimes it is more atmospheric than exact. A region's myths may speak repeatedly of worlds ended by flood, fire, or darkness, while scientific evidence shows that the area did experience major environmental disruptions over long spans, perhaps not one singular event, but many. In those cases, the legend may not map to a specific disaster so much as preserve the correct general sense of living in an unstable landscape. That is no less important. If your ancestors teach that the earth, sea or sky must never be treated as fully tame, and the science later reveals a history of eruptions, earthquakes, storms, or collapse, then the tradition was not wrong in any meaningful human sense. The temptation, of course, is to push too far. Once people notice a few alignments between myth and science, they sometimes begin treating every legend as a coded technical archive waiting to be deciphered. That is where caution becomes essential. Myths are not encrypted lab notes. They are cultural objects shaped by politics, ritual, theology, performance, morality, and imagination, as well as memory. A flood story may preserve a real inundation, but it may also absorb concerns about justice, purity, leadership, and identity. A burning world may reflect eruption, drought, and cosmic symbolism all at once. A fallen star may be inspired by meteors, omens, and philosophical reflection on disorder. The overlap is real, but it is rarely one-to-one. That complexity is precisely why the overlap is interesting rather than trivial. If legends were simply bad science, there would be little to learn from them. If they were simply perfect oral data sets, they would be interesting in a different but narrower way. What makes them valuable is that they preserve how human beings experienced, interpreted, and transmitted encounters with real danger. Science can often recover the event. Legend often preserves the lived emphasis. Put them together and the picture becomes more complete. We learn not only that something happened, but what sort of thing it became in communal memory. Take the recurring flood traditions again. Scientific work on post-glacial sea level rise, regional inundation, ancient tsunamis and river instability shows beyond much doubt that human communities have repeatedly faced dramatic water-related change. Legends across many regions preserve the memory that waters rose, worlds were lost, and survival required preparation, wisdom, or obedience. No, this does not prove one universal global flood in the simple way some would like, but it does show that the broad mythic category of world drowning belongs to a planet and a species for which such experiences are entirely plausible. The overlap is not in a single date, it is in the structure of remembered danger, or consider the myths of fire, darkness, and worlds scorched or remade. Science reveals a long history of eruptions capable of devastating regions, altering skies, harming harvests, and restructuring societies. It reveals wildfire regimes, climatic stresses, severe droughts, and episodes when heat transformed landscapes and human possibilities alike. The legends do not need to distinguish with modern precision between wildfire, eruption, drought, or atmospheric effects in order to preserve a truthful impression of what such periods meant. They remember a world burned or darkened because at the level of human life, that is what those experiences were. The same applies to myths of earlier worlds and vanished civilizations. Archaeology has made one thing abundantly clear. Human societies do not move steadily upward from simplicity to superiority. They build, falter, fragment, reorganize, and sometimes leave behind ruins large enough to impress later generations who no longer understand them fully. Ancient traditions that speak of former ages, lost peoples, sunken cities, and civilizations punished or destroyed may be highly stylized, but they fit the broader archaeological reality far better than older dismissive attitudes ever allowed. The Earth is full of interrupted worlds. It would be stranger if humans had not built stories around that fact. What changes when we accept this overlap is not only our view of the past, but our view of knowledge itself. We begin to see that pre-modern cultures were not merely inventing decorative explanations for things they failed to understand. Often they were preserving difficult truths in the strongest social containers available to them. The stories were memorable because they had to be. A dull warning dies. A sacred warning can live for centuries. The content may shift. The lesson may remain. This also helps explain why science sometimes arrives, rather awkwardly, at positions that traditional communities have inhabited for a very long time. Not identical positions, certainly, Science can tell us far more about mechanism, probability, chronology, and global context. But there is still something slightly humbling about watching modern researchers confirm that a mountain does erupt repeatedly, that a coastline was once further out, that a valley has been devastated by great floods more than once, that a settlement sits in a hazard zone remembered in local lore. The legend does not become science, and science does not become legend. Yet they acknowledge one another across time. That acknowledgement is often strongest when researchers take traditional knowledge seriously, rather than treating it as charming atmosphere. In environmental science, archaeology, and hazard studies, there has been increasing recognition that indigenous and local knowledge systems can preserve observations of landscape behaviour, species change, coastal risk, and rare catastrophic events over very long periods. This does not mean every traditional claim is empirically precise in modern terms, nor that it should be flattened into scientific language to count as real. It means that memory stored through story, practice, taboo, and ritual may capture aspects of the world that scientific institutions, being relatively recent and often short-term in their planning, have not always noticed or valued properly. There is a useful symmetry here. Science brings tools that oral tradition does not possess. It can date layers, model sea level change, reconstruct eruption scales, identify impact traces, and compare regions across immense spans of time. Traditional legend brings continuity of human attention that science often lacks. It knows which places matter, which dangers were repeated often enough to become identity, which memories were judged too important to lose. Science can tell us what happened in the earth. Legend can tell us what people made of it, and why they thought descendants needed to remember. That combination is richer than either alone. Even where direct correspondence is impossible, the overlap can still reshape our sense of plausibility. Suppose a culture speaks of a ruined earlier world destroyed by water and fire. Science may never isolate a single event matching that narrative, yet archaeology reveals repeated settlement destruction, climate instability, coastal retreat, and volcanic disturbance across the broader region. In such a case, the legend may not be a compressed report of one day's disaster. It may be a cultural summary of centuries of vulnerability. Science recovers the distributed process. Legend preserves the distilled conclusion. The world before us was not secure. Ours may not be either. That last point matters more than it first appears. Legends and science overlap not only in what they say about the past, but in what they imply about the future. If myths preserve recurring categories of catastrophe, flood, fire, darkness, celestial threat, collapse, and if science independently confirms that these categories belong to the real history of the planet, then the myths stop being quaint relics and start looking like long-term hazard memory. Not prediction in the theatrical sense, not prophecy with dates and dramatic voiceovers, something more sober, a recognition that these are the kinds of things that have happened before and therefore belong to the menu of what can happen again. That is a very different way of reading old stories. Instead of asking whether a myth is literally true, we begin asking what type of danger it remembers, what human behaviour it associates with vulnerability, what features of landscape it marks, what sort of warning it tries to preserve, and what later science says about the plausibility of that warning. Suddenly the story matters even when its supernatural elements are not treated literally. In some ways, it matters more, because then we're reading it not as failed physics, but as a durable attempt to keep a community alert to recurring threats. This may be why so many myths feel morally charged in ways that still resonate. Societies ignore warnings. They become proud. They build where they should not. They mistake stability for a promise. They assume their current order is the final one. Then water comes, or fire, or the sky behaves strangely, or the old systems fail. Science would phrase this differently, of course. It would speak of exposure, fragility, poor risk management, environmental stress, compounded hazards, and delayed response. But the narrative pattern is not so different. The ancient moral lesson and the modern systems analysis are often staring at the same human weakness through different vocabulary. That overlap becomes particularly sharp in relation to civilizational collapse. Archaeologists and historians now understand much better than earlier generations that complex societies can become fragile through interacting pressures. Climate shifts, drought, food stress, trade disruption, governance failure, war, disease, and natural disasters do not line up neatly in one simple chain, but they can push systems past thresholds. Ancient myths that speak of worlds ending because people lost balance, forgot limits, or became corrupt may sound religious on the surface, yet they may preserve a rough but meaningful truth. Civilizations fail not only because nature strikes them, but because they become vulnerable to what nature has always been capable of doing. There is no need to romanticize the ancients to acknowledge this. They were not mysteriously wiser in every respect. They made terrible decisions with impressive regularity, much as we do. But many of them lived closer to environmental consequence and stored their warnings in cultural forms that could outlast institutions. When legend and science overlap, what we discover is not secret lost technology or hidden advanced knowledge. We discover continuity of human experience. The same species that now runs climate models once sat by firelight, telling children why the sea must never be trusted too far inland, why the mountain must be respected, why certain ruins prove that greatness does not last, why strange signs in the sky are not to be laughed off too quickly. And perhaps that is the most useful correction of all. Modern people often ask whether myths contain facts, as though facts were the only valuable thing a story might carry. But when legend and science begin to overlap, we see that stories can also carry orientation. They can carry categories of threat, habits of respect, memory of place, emotional seriousness, and the social will to remember what should not be forgotten. Science can tell us how often a hazard occurs. Legend can help ensure anyone still cares by the time it returns. Naturally, there are limits. Some overlaps will remain speculative. Some legends will resist interpretation, and should be allowed to remain what they are within their own traditions rather than being treated merely as raw material for modern analysis. Some scientific reconstructions will be too broad or too uncertain to match with any confidence to narrative memory. Honesty matters here. Not every resemblance is meaningful. Not every silence in the evidence disproves the story either. We're dealing with deep time, fractured transmission, and two very different ways of preserving reality. Precision will often be out of reach. But even with those limits, the general picture is difficult to dismiss once it comes into view. The old legends remember exactly the kinds of disasters that science says have shaped human life repeatedly. The Earth confirms that waters rose, mountains erupted, skies darkened, climates shifted, coasts drowned, impacts occurred, and civilizations fell. Oral tradition shows that people carried these experiences forward not as neutral records, but as warnings strong enough to survive. The overlap is not total. It does not need to be. It is already revealing enough. And once you accept that, a more uncomfortable question begins to follow almost automatically. If ancient myths were not merely entertaining stories, but long-term cultural warnings about dangers humanity has faced before, then what exactly were they trying to teach that later societies, including ours, keep failing to learn? Because the overlap between legend and science does not simply flatter the past. It also puts the present in a slightly awkward light. The old stories may have remembered more than we assumed, but memory only matters if someone is willing to act on it. And that, perhaps, is the part we are least comfortable with, because once we stop asking whether the old stories were literally true in every detail and start asking what they were trying to preserve, the conversation changes tone. It is no longer mainly about the past, it becomes about us. It becomes about whether ancient people, in their dramatic and symbol-heavy and occasionally alarming way, were passing down a set of warnings that later societies keep hearing as folklore instead of instruction. Because if flood stories, fire stories, starfall stories and ruined world stories were all carrying fragments of disaster memory, then the question is not only what happened to them, It is what they wanted future people to understand before the same broad patterns returned. And the first warning, I think, is the simplest and the oldest. The world is not stable just because it is familiar. That sounds obvious when put so plainly, which is usually a sign that human beings are about to ignore it on an industrial scale. Familiarity is one of our great sedatives. If the river has stayed within its banks for 20 years, we begin treating that as a personality trait rather than a temporary arrangement. If the mountain has not erupted in living memory, we call it peaceful. If the sea has not crossed the road for several generations, we build closer to it with touching confidence. If the climate has behaved in a relatively generous way during the lifetime of one civilization, that civilization begins to think of generosity as the default setting of the universe. Ancient myths seem to have been constructed in part to resist exactly that complacency. They keep saying the same unfashionable thing. The ground beneath your routines is older than your routines, and less committed to them than you are. That warning matters because civilizations do not usually collapse from pure ignorance. They collapse from a more sophisticated problem, selective memory. They know some things and forget others. They preserve techniques and lose caution. They inherit fertile plains, good harbours, rich deltas, coastlines useful for trade, slopes rich in volcanic soil, and they remember the benefits so vividly that the risks begin to feel like background mythology rather than practical concern. Then a flood comes, or a drought, or an eruption, or a chain of bad years, and suddenly the old story no longer seems quaint. It seems observational. A second warning appears just as often, and it may be even more difficult for advanced societies to hear. Complexity is not the same as resilience. In fact, very often it is the opposite. Ancient stories about proud cities and mighty kingdoms destroyed by catastrophe are sometimes read as simple, moral fables, but beneath the moral language there is often a clear structural insight. The more elaborate a society becomes, the more it depends on systems continuing to function. Food must move, water must arrive, trade must flow, roads must remain passable, administrations must coordinate, trust must hold, storehouses must not fail, sacred and political legitimacy must remain intact enough that people continue cooperating rather than scattering. A small village can be fragile, certainly, but a large civilization has 1,000 additional ways to become brittle. Ancient people may not have described this in the language of systems theory, though they would no doubt have produced an excellent parable about it, but they understood the pattern. Greatness magnifies vulnerability as surely as it magnifies power. That may be why so many old myths insist on the fall of proud places. It is not merely envy of wealth or a priestly dislike of arrogance, though there is plenty of that as well. It is the recognition that large societies start believing their own architecture. They look at walls, granaries, fleets, temples, roads and records, and conclude that they have risen above the ordinary conditions of human risk. Then, one or two essential conditions change: weather, water, soil, trade, seismic stability, external pressure, disease, internal trust, and the grand machine begins to discover how dependent it always was. Myths turn this into divine punishment, because divine punishment is memorable. But the warning underneath is straightforward. The bigger the system, the more carefully it must remember what can break it. There is a third warning in these stories that feels almost embarrassingly current, which is that environmental danger is rarely only environmental. Catastrophe becomes disastrous through human choices. Ancient flood myths often blame corruption, impiety, greed, or broken taboos. At first glance, that can seem like superstition interfering with accurate description. But try translating the moral language into social language, and the old stories become less naive. Corruption may mean elites failing to distribute resources or maintain protective systems. Pride may mean building where warnings were ignored. Impiety may mean violating practical limits embedded in sacred custom. Moral decay may mean a society losing the discipline to respond collectively to danger. In that sense, the mythic explanation is not wholly mistaken. Natural hazards do not act on blank space. They act on social arrangements, and those arrangements are often full of preventable weakness. A river flood becomes a catastrophe when floodplain memory has faded, wetlands have been destroyed, warnings are dismissed, and people have convinced themselves that engineering or wealth has exempted them from history. A drought becomes a civilizational crisis when food systems are rigid, inequality is high, adaptation is delayed, and political trust is weak. A fire becomes devastating when landscapes are mismanaged, settlements are exposed, preparation is poor, and every small warning has been treated as someone else's problem. Ancient myths condense all of this into one grand accusation. The people forgot how to live correctly in relation to the world. That is dramatic language certainly, but not necessarily inaccurate. The stories also seem to warn repeatedly against one specific form of amnesia, the loss of generational memory. This may be the most important warning of all. Many hazards operate on timescales longer than political cycles, personal careers, or even living memory. A devastating flood might come once in several centuries. A major eruption may sleep for generations. A coastline may retreat slowly enough to feel stable, and then suddenly enough to feel impossible. A society that relies only on recent experience to judge risk is therefore in trouble. It mistakes absence for impossibility. It assumes that because the oldest person alive has not seen something, the Earth has agreed to retire the behaviour entirely. Ancient myth appears to have developed partly as a defence against this exact error. It preserves memory beyond direct witness. It says, listen, no one you know was there, but that is not the same thing as saying it did not happen. Modern societies are not especially good at this. We produce extraordinary quantities of information and then structure much of public life around astonishingly short time horizons. We are brilliant at recording and quite poor at retaining seriousness once a generation passes. An ancient community repeating a flood story for 800 years may in some ways be preserving practical caution more effectively than a modern bureaucracy updating a risk report every 5 years that almost no one reads unless their funding depends on it. That is not because storytelling is superior to science. It is because memory must become culture if it's going to outlast convenience. The old myths also seem to warn that survival depends not only on knowing the danger, but on recognizing the signs early enough to act. Over and over these stories include some form of warning. An ancestor listens, most do not. A sign appears in the sky. A sacred rule is broken. The sea behaves strangely. The animals flee. The mountain gives hints. The wise notice. The foolish continue as normal. This pattern is so common that it is difficult to dismiss as narrative habit alone. It reflects a truth about disasters that remains stubbornly relevant. Catastrophe often announces itself, not always dramatically, not always in time, but often enough through signals that require humility and attention to notice. And that may be another lesson we remain oddly reluctant to learn. Warnings are rarely convenient. They usually arrive before certainty. The sea withdrawing before a wave looks curious before it looks lethal. Unusual heat, strange animal behaviour, small tremors, repeated minor failures, slow water loss, weakening harvests, inexplicable weather shifts, all of these can be interpreted away with surprising creativity by people who are invested in normality continuing for one more season. Myth solves that problem by exaggerating the value of attention. It praises the one who listens, obeys, climbs, prepares, stores, or leaves early. It condemns the ones who laugh and stay put. The form is dramatic. The advice is excellent. There is another old warning, and it may be the least flattering to human self-image. Nature is not the only danger in disaster. Human behaviour during stress may be just as destructive. Ancient stories of collapse often do not separate environmental breakdown from social breakdown. Flood comes, then violence. Drought comes, then disorder. Fire comes, then panic. exile, or war. A kingdom weakens, then invaders arrive, or neighbours turn, or the rulers fail. Again, the old stories may frame this morally or divinely, but the broad pattern is accurate. Catastrophe is rarely a single event, it becomes a chain. Environmental shock exposes political weakness. Political weakness worsens the shock. Social trust erodes, and what might have been survivable becomes transformative. If ancient myths keep returning to images of total world endings, one reason may be that from inside a chain reaction, the distinction between natural event and social collapse is not very comforting. We remain vulnerable to that pattern because we still prefer tidy categories. Flood belongs to hydrology, fire belongs to land management, famine belongs to agriculture, collapse belongs to politics, disease belongs to public health. Yet real crises move across categories with alarming confidence. The ancients, lacking our bureaucratic compartments, may actually have seen this more clearly. Their myths do not care whether the disaster began in weather, earth, sky, or human pride. They care that once balance was lost, the whole order could go with it. That is not an ancient superstition, it is a system's warning. The stories also seem to caution against overconfidence in present success. This is where the ruined earlier worlds become particularly relevant. Civilizations standing among older ruins and still imagining themselves exempt from ruin are performing a very human and very repetitive trick. We do it too. Every age thinks itself especially informed, especially organized, especially capable of overcoming the vulnerabilities that humbled its predecessors. Some of those beliefs are justified. We do have better forecasting, engineering, communication, medicine, and scientific understanding than many earlier societies, but capability is not immunity, and there is a tendency in prosperous systems to misread capability as exemption. Ancient myths spend quite a lot of time trying to slap that tendency out of us. The warning is not that greatness is sinful in itself, it is that success breeds a dangerous emotional climate. People stop imagining the impossible, they become offended by limits. They confuse normal operation with permanent order. They begin building their identity around continuity rather than adaptation. Then when discontinuity arrives, it feels not only destructive but absurd. It should not be happening, they say, often while it is very much happening. Ancient storytellers appear to have had limited patience for that posture. They keep telling us, through one lost kingdom after another, that the world does not care how stable your civilization felt from the inside. There is a deeply practical warning in the flood stories that we still struggle with as well, and that is this. Do not build your confidence on borrowed conditions. By borrowed conditions, I mean circumstances that feel normal, but are actually contingent, temporary or inherited from a climate or landscape state that may not last. Fertile floodplains, stable coastlines, regular rainfall, quiet fault lines, predictable fire regimes. All of these can lull a society into building as though the present arrangement were guaranteed. Ancient people often place sacred stories and prohibitions around exactly such places, perhaps because they understood that useful landscapes are frequently dangerous landscapes. Modern societies often remove the story and keep the exposure. We inherit a zone shaped by long environmental compromise and then behave as though it were simply prime real estate. One can almost hear the old myths sighing at this point. They also seem to warn that memory itself must be tended or it decays into decoration. A sacred tale repeated without understanding can become a performance detached from its original practical force. This may have happened many times in the past as well. A community preserves the flood story but no longer treats low ground cautiously. It honours the mountain god but forgets which signs matter. It tells children about the old ruins without connecting them to vulnerability in the present. In that sense, myth is not automatically protective. It can become aesthetic, ceremonial, or merely identity forming unless the warning inside it is actively renewed. That may be another lesson we have not learned. Information, even sacred information, does not protect anyone if it no longer changes behaviour. and perhaps this is where the deepest warning lies. The stories are not simply saying disasters happen, they are saying humans repeatedly fail in similar ways before disasters happen. We delay, we rationalise, we mock the worriers, we prefer continuity, we mistake the absence of recent catastrophe for proof of safety. We invest in systems that work beautifully right until they do not. We allow practical knowledge to erode when it is no longer fashionable. We hand responsibility upward to authorities and downward to future generations at the same time, which is quite an elegant bit of social acrobatics when you think about it. Then, when the event comes, we describe it as unprecedented, even if the myths, ruins, sediments and coastlines have been trying to tell us otherwise for centuries. This may be why ancient warnings are so often wrapped in moral drama. Raw risk information is easy to postpone. Moral urgency is harder. A chart can be ignored. A story about a civilization punished for arrogance gets under the skin. The gods in these stories may stand for many things, but one of them is consequence. Not supernatural consequence necessarily, though that is how the story presents it, but consequence in the broader sense. There are limits built into the world. Ignore them long enough, and reality eventually becomes didactic. There is also an ancient warning about scale that remains difficult for modern minds. Local people often notice things first. Communities close to a coast, a river, a mountain, a forest edge, a changing plain. These people tend to encounter the early signs of trouble before distant authorities or large abstract systems fully register them. Traditional societies encoded much of that local noticing in oral memory, taboo, place-based instruction, and repeated narrative. Modern systems sometimes do the opposite. They collect information centrally and then distribute generalized guidance outward, occasionally overlooking the people who live with the landscape every day. The old myths suggest that local memory matters not because it is charming, but because survival often begins in situated attention. That does not mean romanticizing local knowledge as infallible. No form of knowledge is. It means not discarding it just because it arrives wearing story instead of jargon. A tale about the sea, the mountain, the fire path, or the ruined old settlement may contain centuries of observation compressed into forms built for retention. One of the warnings we still have not learned is that useful knowledge does not always arrive in the style our institutions prefer, and then there is the warning embedded in the stories of earlier worlds, perhaps the most sobering of all. Civilization is not a permanent condition, it is a maintenance project. Ancient myths about former ages, vanished kingdoms and drowned or burned worlds do not merely entertain the possibility of collapse, they normalize it. They treat it as something that has happened before and therefore belongs within the range of things that can happen again. That may be the hardest lesson for modern societies to absorb because so much of our self-understanding depends on progress as a one-way movement. We imagine setbacks, certainly, but not endings of the sort that reorder the whole human landscape. Ancient memory appears to have been less sentimental. It knew that complexity can thin out, that population can retreat, that knowledge can fragment, that trade can shrink, that monumental cities can become quarries and legends. It knew because somewhere, whether through direct experience, inherited memory or visible ruins, people had already seen it. Which is not to say the old stories counsel despair. They do not. On the contrary, most of them are intensely concerned with survival, rebuilding, carrying memory, preserving life, climbing higher, listening better, beginning again. But they do not flatter. They treat recovery as possible and fragility as real. That combination may be healthier than either naive optimism or theatrical doom. It says the world can hurt you badly and still be lived in, but only if you stop pretending that danger belongs exclusively to the past. The ancient warnings, then, are not mysterious once you strip away the surface language. Remember the rare disasters even when they are absent. Respect the landscapes that feed you, because they can also kill you. Do not assume large systems are strong simply because they are large. Listen to signs before they become events. Preserve knowledge in forms people will actually remember. Take ruins seriously. Treat stability as temporary and therefore worth maintaining rather than worshipping. Do not confuse prosperity with permission to forget. Do not believe that because your version of the world is impressive, it has escaped the conditions of the earth. It is frankly a very good set of warnings, and perhaps what we still have not learned is not the content so much as the posture required to receive it. The stories ask for humility, not passivity, not fearfulness, not a gloomy admiration for catastrophe, but humility in the oldest sense. The recognition that human beings live inside systems larger than themselves, and that memory, whether stored in ritual, ruin, sediment, or story, is one of the few gifts the past can offer the future if the future is willing to listen, which leaves one final question, and perhaps it is the most personal one of all. If myth is not just imagination but memory, if all these old tales of flood and fire and falling stars and vanished worlds were carrying warnings across centuries, then they were not trying only to tell us what happened. They were trying to ask something of us in return. They were asking whether, having inherited the memory, we intend to live any differently because of it. And perhaps that is where the question has been leading all along, because once you spend enough time with these old stories, once you stop treating them as ornaments from the childhood of the world and start considering that they may contain some part of humanity's longest memory, you eventually arrive at a point where curiosity is no longer enough. It is one thing to ask whether myths preserve traces of flood, fire, falling stars, lost coastlines, and broken civilizations. It is another to ask what those traces are for. Memory is never only about the past. Not deep memory, not the sort that survives through ritual and story and inherited caution. Deep memory is directional. It is passed forward because someone believed it would still matter to people who had not yet been born. So if myth is memory, then it is not simply asking us to admire the past more respectfully. It is asking us to do something with what the past kept trying to hand us. The first thing I think is very simple. It is asking us to remember on purpose. Not vaguely and not sentimentally. On purpose. It is asking us to resist the human habit of allowing rare danger to fade just because it is rare. Most of the events preserved in ancient myth were not daily inconveniences. They were threshold events. They were the kinds of things that happen infrequently enough for societies to forget them, and then violently enough to punish the forgetting. A flood that comes once in several centuries is perfectly designed to defeat ordinary human planning. So is a major eruption. So is a coastline shifting beyond the experience of living generations. So is the long build-up to environmental collapse. Myths appear to exist partly because ordinary memory is too short for these things. The story survives where direct witness cannot. That means one of the tasks being handed to us is the task of maintaining memory beyond personal experience. Modern societies often behave as though information storage has solved this problem. We have archives, data centers, satellite records, climate models, hazard maps, scientific institutions, museums, libraries, and more ways of storing knowledge than any previous civilization could have imagined. That is all extremely useful. But stored information is not the same thing as living memory. A warning can exist in 10,000 places and still fail to shape behavior if it has not entered culture, habit, design, education, and emotional seriousness. Ancient myth seems to understand this better than many modern systems do. It does not merely store, it impresses, it gives memory weight, it makes forgetting feel dangerous. If myth is memory, then perhaps what it is asking us to do is not just collect facts, but build forms of public memory strong enough to survive prosperity, political turnover, fashion, and boredom. And that leads quite naturally to the second request. It is asking us to take limits seriously before limits introduce themselves in more forceful ways. This may be the single most repeated lesson in all the old catastrophe stories, though it is almost never phrased politely. People cross a line. They become too confident, too careless, too rigid, too disrespectful of whatever larger order the story recognizes. Then reality returns to scale. In the language of myth, that often means the gods punish arrogance. In the language of modern systems, it means societies become exposed and brittle because they assume conditions will remain favourable or manageable. These are not as far apart as they first appear. The old stories may be using divine vocabulary, but the underlying lesson is recognisably practical. There are limits built into landscapes, climates, coasts, rivers, mountains, resources, and social structures. A civilization that treats those limits as optional eventually relearns why they were there. So what is myth asking us to do with that? It is asking for humility, though not the decorative kind. Not the kind where one says very wise things about the universe and then continues building exactly as before. It is asking for operational humility. Build as though rivers have histories. Plan as though rare events are still events. Treat coastlines as moving boundaries rather than fixed investments. Design systems that can fail in pieces rather than all at once. Leave margins, preserve redundancy. Do not confuse a few generations of calm with permanent safety. Respect the simple possibility that the environment supporting your success is not a static background but an active participant in your future. The myths would likely consider this a basic adulthood test for civilizations. They are also, I think, asking us to stop treating resilience as a technical add-on and start treating it as a cultural obligation. One of the striking things about ancient stories is that they rarely separate practical survival from moral seriousness. The person who listens survives. The person who mocks the warning does not. The group that respects the dangerous place endures. The group that forgets or desecrates or grows complacent is swept aside. We do not need to adopt the supernatural framework to understand the social function of that pattern. It is a way of saying that preparation is not merely clever. It is part of living responsibly in a world that can turn. A society that cannot make preparedness meaningful will usually postpone it until preparedness becomes impossible. Modern societies know how to discuss resilience in reports, conferences, committees, and very expensive strategy documents. We are less consistent at making it part of ordinary civic imagination. Many people still think of preparedness as a specialist concern, something for engineers, emergency planners, geologists, meteorologists, insurance analysts, and the occasional person in a fluorescent jacket who appears only when everyone else is already regretting earlier decisions. Myth suggests a different model. It puts memory of danger into common culture. Everyone knows the story. Everyone understands the shape of the warning. Everyone inherits at least some responsibility to remember what kind of world they are living in. If myth is memory, perhaps it is asking us to recover that shared seriousness rather than outsourcing all thought about risk to institutions and hoping the institutions remain faster than the hazard. There is another request in these stories, and it has to do with attention. Myth is asking us to notice more, sooner, and with less vanity. This is not especially glamorous advice, which may be why it is so often ignored. Many catastrophe stories revolve around warning signs that were visible but discounted. The sea withdraws, the mountain mutters, the sky behaves strangely, the animals are restless, the weather does not feel right, water disappears where it should not, fire moves differently, small failures accumulate. In the story, the wise person notices and acts. The foolish person laughs, delays, explains, or continues with routine because the routine is emotionally easier than admitting reality may be changing. That pattern is so common in myth because it is so common in life. Human beings are very good at interpreting warning signs as temporary noise, right up until the moment they become undeniable, and at that point there is usually less room to do anything elegant about it. So perhaps myth is asking us to cultivate an older and less flattering kind of intelligence, the intelligence of paying attention to conditions rather than only to plans. That means listening to landscapes, listening to local memory, listening to people whose work or lives keep them close to environmental change, listening to communities that remember old hazards in forms outsiders attempted to dismiss as folklore, listening to science certainly, because science is one of our most powerful tools for seeing slow change before it becomes obvious, but also listening beyond the register of institutional confidence. Ancient stories repeatedly suggest that danger is often legible before it is officially acknowledged. The lesson is not to panic at every irregularity. It is to stop assuming that reality owes us certainty before we are obliged to pay attention. These myths are also asking something of our relationship with time. They're asking us to think in longer intervals than comfort prefers. One of the reasons ancient myths are so hard for modern societies to absorb is that they operate on civilizational timescales. They are not interested in quarterly results, election cycles, annual targets, or whether the market found the last statement reassuring. They're interested in what returns after generations. They remember the flood that comes after everyone who saw the previous one is gone. They remember the fire that reshapes a landscape centuries after settlement made people trust it. They remember the collapse that looks sudden only because its causes accumulated slowly. In other words, they ask us to consider futures larger than our habits. This is difficult, not because people are foolish, but because everyday life is structured against it. Institutions drift toward the short term. Politics rewards immediate visibility. Markets reward efficiency more easily than redundancy. Individuals worry, understandably, about what is nearest at hand. Yet the planet on which civilization depends does not always organize its risks according to those schedules. If myth is memory, then it is asking us to close that mismatch a little. It is asking us to design with longer horizons in mind. To teach history not as a series of finished episodes, but as a catalogue of recurring conditions. To make room in public life for the possibility that what has not happened recently may still be among the most important things to prepare for. There is a more personal level to this as well. The old stories seem to ask each generation whether it intends to be a good ancestor. That phrase can sound sentimental very quickly, so it is worth grounding it. To be a good ancestor in this context is not to speak movingly about future people. It is to pass on useful memory in forms that will still work when one's own preferences are irrelevant. Ancient communities did this through story, ritual, taboo, sacred geography, and repeated warning. We may use different tools, and we should, but the principle remains. Are we transmitting memory in a way future people can actually use, or merely producing information in the hope that someone later will assemble seriousness from the fragments? This matters because forgetting is not passive. Forgetting is often produced. Landscapes are redeveloped until old hazard lines become invisible. Traditional knowledge is dismissed because it does not sound modern enough. Ruins are aestheticized rather than studied as warnings. Stories are turned into entertainment stripped of practical force. Institutions lose records, lose continuity, lose funding, lose focus. People move away from place-based memory and inherit only generalized confidence. All of this creates amnesia by degrees. Myth, by contrast, fights forgetting with drama, repetition, and identity. It says, no, this must stay with you. If myth is memory, perhaps it is asking us to become much more deliberate about what we choose not to let disappear. It is also asking us, I think, to take human fragility seriously without becoming melodramatic about it. This is a difficult balance. Ancient catastrophe stories are full of destruction, but they are not always despairing. Most of them contain survivors, rebuilders, carriers of seed, memory, lore, or craft. The lesson is not that humans are doomed. The lesson is that humans are vulnerable, and therefore must behave as though vulnerability is real. Modern societies often swing between two unhelpful extremes here. On one side there is blind confidence, the idea that progress has effectively retired the older categories of danger. On the other there is theatrical doom, which treats catastrophe as inevitable spectacle, and therefore drains practical agency from the future. The myths offer a third posture. Be serious. Be prepared. Expect disruption. Build memory. Preserve life. Begin again when necessary. But do not worship either security or collapse. Neither deserves it. This may be why so many stories center not on the destruction itself, but on the few who carry something through it. They save family, animals, seed, craft, law, ritual, knowledge, or simply the habit of beginning again. That is not accidental. It suggests that memory of catastrophe is not just meant to frighten. It is meant to shape continuity. What must survive if the larger system fails? What should be preserved even when ordinary order is gone? In a modern context, that question becomes broader. What forms of knowledge, infrastructure, local skill, ecological understanding and social trust remain functional when complex systems are stressed? Myth cannot answer that in technical terms, but it can force the question back into view. It can remind us that societies are measured not only by how efficiently they operate in calm times, but by what they can carry through disorder. Another thing these old stories seem to ask of us is respect for place. Not in the soft, decorative sense of liking scenic views, but in the practical sense of knowing where you are. This may be one of the greatest losses of modern mobility and abstraction. Many people now live in places whose deep histories they do not know. They may not know the flood paths, the old shoreline, the burn cycles, the fault lines, the abandoned river courses, the buried ruins, the previous settlements, the drought memory, the landslide history, the sacred prohibitions that once encoded practical caution. They inherit infrastructure, zoning maps, maybe some insurance language, and whatever the recent past happened to leave visible. But ancient myth is profoundly place-based. It says this valley, this coast, this mountain, this spring, this plain, this city. The warning is not generic. It belongs somewhere. If myth is memory, then it is asking us to reacquaint ourselves with the specific realities of the places that hold us, feed us, and sometimes endanger us. That means asking different questions of landscape. Not only what can be built here, but what happened here before. Not only what is profitable, but what does this place remember? Not only what do current conditions suggest, but what did older conditions do to those who lived here previously? There is nothing mystical about this. It is ordinary seriousness. Yet myth often has to push us toward it, because ordinary seriousness is surprisingly difficult to sustain in comfortable times. The stories are also asking us to treat knowledge systems less arrogantly. One of the more interesting things about the overlap between legend and science is that it reveals how much can be lost when we dismiss one form of memory simply because it does not arrive in our preferred format. Ancient myths do not replace science. They do not tell us everything we need to know about hazard, climate, geology, or risk. But they do remind us that useful warning can be carried in narrative, practice, ritual, and long oral continuity. If myth is memory, then it is asking us not to be so quick in deciding what counts as knowledge. A community saying the sea once stood there may not present its statement in technical language, but the statement still deserves attention. A mountain story may not be geology, but it may preserve generations of correct caution. A ruin may not come with its own textbook, but it is still a lesson in failure waiting to be read. This is not an argument against skepticism. It is an argument against smugness. The difference matters. Skepticism asks careful questions. Smugness dismisses before listening. Ancient myths, taken seriously as memory, ask us for the first and warn us against the second. They also ask for a change in what we think progress means. If progress is understood only as increased control, increased speed, increased extraction, increased scale, increased insulation from inconvenience, then myth is likely to view it with some suspicion. Not because comfort is evil, or tools are suspect, or cities are a mistake, but because every one of those gains can produce amnesia if it is not accompanied by deeper memory and stronger limits. Ancient stories do not oppose human flourishing. Many of them celebrate skill, wisdom, survival, and even great civilizations. What they oppose is the belief that flourishing has abolished vulnerability. If myth is memory, then perhaps it is asking us to define progress more carefully. Progress would not mean simply becoming more capable. It would mean becoming more capable without becoming more forgetful. That is harder. It requires resilience, not just efficiency. Redundancy, not just optimization. Cultural memory, not just storage. Public seriousness, not just private concern. Institutions that can learn across generations. Education that teaches not only triumphs but thresholds. Planning that includes rare events without treating them as irrelevant because they are politically inconvenient. It asks us to grow up a little, which is not always the most popular invitation. And then there is the moral core beneath all of this. If myth is memory, what it may be asking most insistently is that we behave like participants in the world rather than owners of it. That sounds philosophical, but the practical meaning is not obscure. Participants respect systems they depend on. Owners imagine systems exist to serve their immediate preferences. Participants adapt. Owners demand continuity. Participants inherit and pass on. Owners consume and assume replacement will be arranged somehow by people they will never meet. Ancient catastrophe stories repeatedly punish the second posture. They are full of people, cities, or whole civilizations that behave as though the world is theirs to command until the world objects. One need not believe in the literal gods of those stories to understand the warning. The warning is against entitlement toward reality. This is perhaps why the myths remain emotionally powerful even in secular ages. We still recognize the type. We still know what it looks like when a society becomes too sure of itself, too detached from place, too willing to trade long memory for short gain, too impressed by its own systems to notice what those systems depend on. We still know what it means to inherit warnings and file them under interesting rather than urgent. That is why the stories feel old and current at the same time. They are not only about ancient people, they are about recurring human habits. So what is myth asking us to do? It is asking us to remember more deeply, build more humbly, listen earlier, plan longer, respect place, preserve warning in culture as well as data, and stop mistaking temporary stability for a law of the universe. It is asking us to see disaster not as an exotic interruption from outside history, but as part of the real conditions under which history unfolds. It is asking us to regard ruins as messages, not scenery. To treat local knowledge as potentially hard-earned rather than quaint. To think about what we owe future people besides cleverness. To accept that the planet has always been active and that civilization has always been in negotiation with forces larger than itself. Most of all, perhaps, it is asking us not to wait for certainty before we become serious. The old stories were built precisely because certainty usually arrives too late. By the time the flood is visible to everyone, the useful moment for memory has already passed. By the time the mountain is unmistakable, the slopes are no longer a place for debate. By the time the great city becomes a ruin, the lesson is available only to those who come after. Myth exists because someone wanted the warning to arrive before the event for at least one future generation. It is difficult not to feel that intention once you have sat with these stories long enough, and perhaps that is the quietest and most persistent thing they ask of us. Not fear, not reverence for the past as such, not obsession with apocalypse, just seriousness worthy of inheritance. The willingness to receive memory as a responsibility rather than as entertainment. The willingness to ask what the old stories were protecting and whether we are prepared to protect it too. The willingness to imagine that people before us, with fewer instruments but no less contact with reality, may have understood something essential about what it takes to endure on this earth without being endlessly surprised by it. Because if myth is memory, then it is not really speaking backward at all. It is speaking forward, still, in the only voice that had any chance of lasting this long, and whether we hear flood, fire, falling stars, ruined worlds, or simply the repeated human experience of forgetting what matters until the world reminds us, the request remains much the same. Pay attention, carry this carefully, live as though the past was trying to keep you from having to learn everything again the hard way.